I went camping alone once in the spring of 2022, deep in a forested area about 3 hours north of where I lived at the time. It was just after the snow had finally melted, and everything was damp, cold, and quiet. The idea had started from a simple itch I had, one I get sometimes when I feel too boxed in by daily life. I just wanted to be out there, away from screens, away from people, away from all the regular patterns that were dragging me down. I picked a state forest that wasn't a well-known one, somewhere I found through online forums and old hiking blogs. I didn't want a proper campground with fire pits and numbered sites. I wanted something more isolated. I parked my car at a small dirt pull-off that barely had enough room for it. From there, I hiked with my backpack about 5 miles along a barely marked trail until I found a flat, quiet spot near a narrow creek. The area was dense with trees, mostly spruce, birch, and pine, and the ground was covered in a thick layer of wet leaves and fallen branches. The air smelled like moss and cold water. I could hear birds occasionally, but even they were few and far between. Everything felt untouched, like the world had forgotten this little part of the woods. I set up camp by early afternoon. I pitched my small tent just off the creek, where the ground was soft but dry enough to sleep on. I boiled some water, made a simple meal of instant rice and tuna, and sat on a log to eat. I didn't bring anything fancy, just the basics. My plan was to stay for 2 nights, maybe 3 if the weather held. The sky was mostly gray, but it wasn't raining yet. It felt peaceful in a strange way, almost like the silence had a weight to it. I didn't realize at the time that it was the kind of silence you only notice when something's off. That first night, I went to bed early. I'd been walking for hours with a heavy pack, and I figured a good night's sleep would help me feel fresh the next morning. I climbed into my sleeping bag, zipped the tent up tight, and lay there listening to the faint sound of the creek. The wind picked up now and then, rustling the trees just enough to sound like far-off footsteps if you weren't used to it. I camped before, so I didn't spook easily. Still, sometime around midnight, I woke up to a sound that didn't fit. It wasn't an animal noise, and it wasn't wind or water either. It was more like something snapping, a single sharp crack like a branch breaking under pressure. I froze and held my breath. I waited for it to repeat, but it didn't. There was nothing else after that. I told myself it was just a tree settling, or maybe a branch falling under its own weight. The forest was still wet and heavy from the thaw, so it made sense. But I didn't fall back asleep right away. I lay there for a long time, listening too hard, my ears straining against the darkness. The worst part about sleeping in a tent alone in the middle of nowhere isn't what's actually out there. It's the way your mind fills in what might be. Eventually, I did fall back asleep, though it was light by the time I drifted off again. I woke up late the next morning, groggy and a little stiff. It had rained sometime in the early morning, so everything outside was slick and muddy. I made oatmeal and instant coffee and sat on the same log, watching the water roll by. I didn't plan to do much that day. I explored a little around the area, marked some trees with tape so I wouldn't get lost, and gathered more firewood. Even though I didn't build a fire the first night, I thought maybe I would the next. But all day, I kept noticing little things that made me feel uneasy. First, it was just a feeling. The way the air felt too still sometimes, or how I didn't hear birds anymore. But later, I started seeing small signs. A stick formation near the edge of my sight that I didn't remember being there. A pile of stones stacked up along the creek, just a few feet from where I'd filled my water bottle. Things like that. They weren't dramatic, but they didn't feel right. I tried to think back and tell myself they'd always been there, that maybe I just missed them the first day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else had been there since I arrived. By the time it got dark, the sky was heavy with clouds, and the temperature dropped. I didn't bother with a fire. I ate a cold dinner inside the tent and listened to the drizzle start again. The forest around me felt darker than it had the night before, like something had drained the color out of it. I went to bed early again, but I couldn't sleep. Every creak outside, every brush of wind against the fabric of my tent made my heart skip. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself that fear comes easy in the dark, that nothing was really wrong. Then I heard it again. Another snap, this time closer. Not a loud one, but crisp, like someone stepping on a small stick. And then silence. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. My ears rang from how hard I was trying to listen. Nothing. Then a minute later, a different sound. A soft thump, like something heavy hitting the ground or being dropped. It wasn't right outside, but it wasn't far either. Maybe 30 feet away, just past the line of trees I could barely see through the mesh of the tent. I stayed still for almost an hour, muscles tight, my hand resting near the zipper in case I needed to get out fast. But there was no more sound after that. No footsteps, no movement, just the wind and drizzle and the quiet roar of my own blood in my ears. I didn't sleep that night. I just waited, my mind spinning in circles, wondering if I was alone or not. When morning came, I unzipped the tent slowly and looked around. Everything looked mostly the same, but I noticed fresh prints in the mud about 10 feet from where I'd been sleeping. Not shoe prints, boot prints, the kind with thick soles and square tread. Someone had been there. They weren't mine. I checked around the site and found more of them, walking in a strange pattern. Not toward the tent, but around it, like someone had been circling it during the night. I followed them for a bit, but they disappeared near the creek, where the mud turned to wet stone. I felt sick, not scared the way you are when you see a snake or hear a bear, but a deeper, colder fear, the kind that makes your stomach tighten and your skin itch. I packed up fast. I didn't eat. I just threw everything into my backpack and got ready to leave. I knew the trail was rough and the hike back would be long, but I didn't care. I wanted out. I took one last look around the site to make sure I didn't forget anything, and that's when I saw it. Near the tree line, about 15 feet from my tent, someone had wedged a dead bird into a split in the trunk of a pine tree. A small blackbird, its neck twisted at an angle that wasn't natural. It hadn't been there the day before. There was no way I would have missed it. Felt like a message. I didn't stay to figure out what it meant. The hike back was a blur. I kept checking over my shoulder, stopping every 10 minutes to listen. I thought I heard something behind me once or twice, but it was too faint to be sure. The trail felt longer going back, and it started raining again halfway through. Everything turned slick and cold. I slipped twice, once hard enough to scrape my palm open, but I didn't stop. When I finally saw my car, I almost cried. I threw my gear into the back and peeled out of there, not even bothering to brush the mud off my boots or check my mirrors. On the way back, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror. Nothing was there, but it felt like something might be. I drove all the way home without stopping. When I got there, I dumped everything in the garage and locked every door and window. I didn't sleep that night either. The whole experience sat in my chest like a stone. I kept playing it over and over in my head, trying to make sense of it. I didn't tell anyone at first because I didn't know what to say. Nothing had really happened, not in a way that you could explain. But I knew what I felt. Later that week, I checked online forums and backcountry groups to see if anyone else had camped in that same forest. I found a couple of posts that talked about strange things. People finding carved symbols on trees, hearing footsteps, coming back to their campsites and finding items moved or stolen. A few people mentioned seeing someone deep in the woods, someone who didn't speak and didn't seem to belong there. But no one had any real answers, just rumors and stories. I never went back. I still camp sometimes, but never alone, and never without letting someone know exactly where I'm going. I also started carrying more protection with me, not just bear spray, but something heavier. I know now that the real dangers in the wild aren't bears or snakes. It's people. People hiding out where no one expects to find them. People who live off the grid and don't want company. People who watch. What still bothers me isn't just the prints or the bird or the noise. It's the fact that whoever it was didn't try to hurt me. They could have. They were close. They walked right past my tent. But they didn't do anything except let me know they were there. Like it was a warning. Like I'd wandered too close to something I wasn't supposed to see. And the worst part is, I'll never know who it was or what they wanted. I was lucky to leave when I did. I think about that a lot. How things could have gone differently if I'd stayed just one more night. I've gone on a lot of solo camping trips in my life, mostly because I prefer being alone and I find peace in the woods. There's something about getting away from the noise of everything. Phones, traffic, people. It's just trees, dirt, the wind, maybe a lake if I'm lucky. I plan my trips carefully, check the weather, let someone know where I'm going, bring my knife, my first aid kit, food that doesn't need refrigeration, and my tent and gear. Nothing fancy. I don't need much. I try to camp in places where I'm unlikely to run into other people. I know a few spots that are quiet, out of the way, not too far from water, and safe as long as you stay smart. One trip stands out from the others, though. It was around mid-September when I went out that time. The days were still warm, but the nights had started getting cold. I like that kind of weather. Fewer bugs, fewer campers, and the animals aren't as active as they are in the summer. I had picked a spot I'd only visited once before, a couple years back. It was in a hilly, forested area about 2 hours' drive from my place, then another hour's hike in from the gravel road. The area was covered in tall pines, a mix of maple and birch in the lower ground, and a little stream ran down one side of a clearing where I planned to pitch my tent. There were signs of deer in the area and I'd seen foxes before, but no large predators and no reason to be worried if I kept my food sealed and stored properly. I got there early in the afternoon. I parked my truck where the road ended, strapped on my pack, and started the hike in. The air smelled clean and earthy. I could hear birds, the occasional squirrel rustling through the leaves, and the wind moving gently through the treetops. It was quiet, but in that peaceful kind of way, like the woods were alive but calm. I reached the clearing about 45 minutes later, a wide, slightly sloped patch of ground nestled between trees and tall brush. The stream was running low but still clear, cutting through some smooth rocks that looked like they'd been there for centuries. I walked the perimeter of the clearing just to be sure nothing had changed since the last time. It looked the same. I set up my tent on the higher side of the clearing, just far enough from the stream to keep dry in case of any rain, but close enough that I could fetch water easily. I boiled a pot from the stream right after I set up, let it cool, then stored it in a container. I don't like relying on filters alone out there. After the tent was up, I gathered some firewood, enough for the evening and the next morning, and built a small ring with rocks I found around the area. I had brought a small hatchet with me to break down some of the thicker branches. Everything was routine, felt good. I ate dinner just as the sun started to dip below the trees. It was one of those vacuum-packed meals you just add hot water to. Not great, but it does the job. I watched the light shift in the woods while I ate, how the long shadows stretched over the ground and how the birds quieted down as night fell. It got colder quickly, and I added a layer before lighting the fire. There wasn't much to do after that. I sat there for a while, poking at the fire with a stick, sipping water, just listening. It's funny how loud the woods can get once your ears adjust. Crickets, distant owls, the creaking of branches in the wind. It all blends together, but none of it sounded unusual. I turned in just after dark, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and listened to the night sounds for a while longer. Eventually, I drifted off. Sometime in the early hours, I woke up. Not from a sound, not from cold, but from a feeling. I can't explain it well. It was like my body knew something wasn't right. My heart was beating faster than normal, and I had that weird, heavy feeling in my chest, like when you're about to get bad news. I lay still, listening. I didn't hear anything at first, just the normal sounds of the forest at night. Then I caught something soft like a footstep, not an animal's. It wasn't a snapping twig or the shuffle of something in the underbrush. It was deliberate, slow. One step, then another. I didn't move. I lay there breathing as quietly as I could. My hand reached for the knife I always keep near me when I sleep out there. I slid it out of its sheath, careful not to make noise. The step stopped, then came again, closer. Still soft. Someone was out there. I was sure of it now. Maybe 20 or 30 feet from my tent. No flashlight, no talking, no rustling like someone making camp or walking a trail. Just slow steps moving through the brush and then stopping again. I kept still, gripping the knife in one hand. I didn't know what to do. If it was someone who meant trouble, stepping out of the tent would make me an easy target. But staying inside meant I was boxed in. After maybe a minute or two, I didn't hear any more steps, just silence. I waited another 10 minutes before I moved. Then I sat up slowly, unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. It was pitch dark, no movement. I didn't see anything. I waited, watching, until the cold crept through my clothes. Still nothing. I sat like that for an hour. When I finally lay back down, I didn't sleep. I just rested with my eyes half closed, gripping the knife, my ears on high alert. Nothing else happened that night, but I didn't relax. The next morning, I stepped out and checked the area around the tent. There were faint impressions in the dirt, not clear enough to tell much, but too big for any animal I knew around there. They weren't boot prints exactly, more like smooth indentations where someone had stepped carefully. I looked around the clearing and the tree line. Nothing seemed disturbed, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I thought about packing up and heading out early, but I told myself maybe it was just a hiker who got turned around or someone scouting a hunting spot. Not common in that area, but not impossible either. I spent the rest of the day like I had planned. Collected more wood, explored a few nearby ridges, cooked lunch, but I kept my knife on me the entire time, even while bathing in the stream. That night, I built the fire bigger than before, letting the flames rise higher, hoping it would signal that someone was here and awake. I ate, sat for a while, then got ready to sleep again. I set a tripwire around part of the clearing using fishing line and some empty cans. A trick I'd learned a while back. It wouldn't stop anyone, but I'd hear if someone walked through. Around midnight, the cans rattled. Just once. I was already awake, so I shot up immediately, knife in hand, heart pounding. I stayed inside the tent again, straining my ears. I heard nothing else for a long time. Then faintly, that same sound, soft steps. Just a few. Then nothing. I thought about shouting, but I didn't want to let whoever it was know exactly where I was inside the tent, or whether I was armed. I sat there, still, muscles tense, for over an hour again. No more noise, no more movement. To first light, I packed everything. I didn't eat, didn't make coffee, just shoved my gear into the pack and checked the perimeter one last time. One of the cans was missing. The fishing line had been pulled slightly, just enough to trigger the noise. I didn't like that. I didn't like any of it. I started back toward the road immediately, keeping a steady pace, listening behind me the entire time. About halfway back to the truck, I saw something that made me stop. On a tree trunk, maybe 100 feet off the trail, was a mark. It looked like a carved X, rough, not clean like a hiker's trail blaze. It hadn't been there before, I was sure of it. The bark was still raw around the edges, fresh. Someone had been out there, and they'd marked a tree near where I'd camped. I kept walking faster now. Didn't stop for water, didn't rest. Just kept moving until I reached the truck. When I got there, nothing seemed disturbed, but I still felt that tight pressure in my chest, like eyes on my back. I got in, locked the doors, and drove. I didn't even turn on the radio. My ears stayed tuned to the silence, listening for anything. Any sound from the woods behind me as the trees grew smaller in the mirror. When I got home, I told myself maybe I overreacted. Maybe it was just a hunter or someone passing through. But I'd camped alone enough times to know the difference between a deer rustling in the leaves and the deliberate movement of human steps. And I've never had anyone come that close at night, without light, without making themselves known, and then disappear again. Twice. A few days later, I checked an online forum for hikers and outdoorsmen in that area. I didn't say much, just asked if anyone had camped in that general region recently and seen strange tracks or signs of someone else around. One guy replied, saying he'd been out there earlier that summer and had seen something similar. Tripwire cans getting tripped, soft footsteps at night. No trace of who or what. He packed out early too. Another user mentioned seeing odd markings on trees like signs, but not the kind used for navigation. No one had clear answers, but a few people mentioned they'd stopped going to that particular spot. I haven't gone back since. I still go camping, still like being out there alone. But I pick different places now. I make sure they're far from any trails and I rotate locations every time. I keep extra gear near me when I sleep. I still listen to the woods, still enjoy the peace, but I don't let myself forget that. had always been into solo camping. I'm not exactly sure why, but there was something peaceful about being alone out in the woods, away from everything, where the only sounds I could hear were the wind in the trees, the chirping of birds, and the occasional rustle of leaves. I started doing it regularly after I turned 26, when I got tired of the constant noise in the city. I worked in IT back then, and everything about my life felt too digital, too fast, too artificial. I didn't hate it, but I knew I needed to disconnect from time to time, just to remember what it felt like to breathe clean air, watch the sun come up through the trees, and sleep without a glowing screen near my face. This one trip I took, though, was different. I still remember the date clearly, September 19th. It was supposed to be a 5-day solo camping trip up in a remote stretch of national forest up north. I had done a few shorter ones that summer already, but this time I wanted to go deeper than I ever had before, somewhere not marked with trails or cleared spots for fires. I spent days mapping it out, using satellite imagery to mark streams, old logging paths, and clearings that looked good for setting up camp. I packed smart: enough food, water purifiers, backup batteries, a solid first aid kit, an emergency GPS, and a flare gun. I had a 3-person tent just for extra space, a bear canister, weather gear, everything. The drive took a while. Once I passed the last gas station, I still had to go down a rough gravel road for almost 40 kilometers, then park and hike in about 8 more kilometers with all my gear. The trail was rough, overgrown in places, but I liked that. It meant fewer people had been there, and that's what I wanted. I found a clearing near a small stream that wasn't on the maps. There were a lot of trees around, mostly pine and some thick underbrush. It looked perfect, flat, shaded, near water, and with no signs of recent use. I set up camp there, staked everything down tightly, got my food hung up on a line between 2 trees, and settled in. The first day and night were peaceful. I hiked around the area a bit, getting familiar with the surroundings. I kept a mental note of landmarks, large stones, broken branches, a patch of bright red ferns that stood out from the green. I made a small fire that night with some dry pine needles and twigs, sat quietly as the sun went down, and slept early. I was tired from the hike in. It was cold but manageable. I had layered clothing and a good sleeping bag. The next day, I ventured out a bit farther. I followed the stream upstream for a while and found a small rock ledge that offered a view of the forest around. It was beautiful. I spent a while just sitting there, not doing anything. No phone, no internet, no distractions. I felt good. On my way back, though, I got this weird feeling in my gut like I was being watched. I looked around and saw nothing, but the sensation didn't really go away. It wasn't fear exactly, just discomfort. I chalked it up to nerves or being out in such deep woods alone. The forest has a way of playing with your senses sometimes. Everything is unfamiliar, and your brain starts tricking you. When I got back to camp that afternoon, I noticed something strange. My food bag, which I had hung maybe 15 feet up between 2 trees, was slightly lower than before. Not torn open or damaged, just sagging. At first, I thought maybe the rope had stretched or come loose. I pulled it down and checked it. The knots looked the same, and there wasn't any fraying. I tightened it again, pulled it back up, and left it. That night, I kept my fire going a bit longer than usual and didn't sleep as easily. I kept thinking about the food bag, about that weird feeling I had earlier. I eventually drifted off sometime after midnight, at around 3:40 in the morning. I know because I checked my watch. I woke up to a sound that made every hair on my neck stand up. It wasn't an animal growl or some big noise. It was subtle, almost nothing at all. But that's what made it worse. It was the sound of something brushing against the side of my tent. Just one slow drag along the fabric. Not fast, not hard. Just one long slide, from the back to the side, like a finger running across canvas. I froze completely still. I didn't breathe for a few seconds. My flashlight was in the side pocket of my sleeping bag, but I didn't move to grab it. I just listened. There were no other sounds. No footsteps, no crunching leaves. I lay there for at least half an hour, fully awake, fully aware. Eventually, I convinced myself it might have been a branch or something falling. Maybe a breeze caught something. I didn't really believe it, but I needed a reason to calm down. I didn't sleep again that night, In the morning, I walked around the tent carefully. There were no scratch marks or prints. Nothing was out of place. The food bag was still up. I tried to let it go. I made coffee, ate breakfast, and decided to hike out in a different direction to clear my mind. I followed a faint game trail I had noticed on the satellite map, thinking maybe it led to a meadow or a larger water source. About 3 kilometers out, I found something that stopped me cold. It was an old hunting blind, maybe 10 feet off the ground in a tree. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but the ladder was intact. I climbed up, just curious to see the view. Inside, I found some stuff that made me uncomfortable. There was an old pair of binoculars, rusted and cracked, a knife with a wooden handle, dull but clean, and an empty canteen, all old, dusty, like they'd been sitting there for years. But then there was something else, a small notepad with the corner torn off. It was mostly ruined from water and mold, but one page was still legible. It had just a few words written in pencil. "He comes at night. Don't sleep too deep." I stared at that page for a long time. I didn't know what to make of it. It felt like something out of a movie. The writing didn't look new, and it was just vague enough to get in my head. I left the blind and started heading back fast. I had this sense that I wasn't supposed to be there. I kept glancing behind me. Every snapping twig made me flinch. I made it back to camp around 3 p.m. and seriously considered packing up. But I had 2 days left, and part of me didn't want to leave out of fear. I didn't want to feel like I got pushed out of the woods by my own mind. I tried to reason with myself. Old hunters write weird stuff all the time. Maybe it was just superstition or a joke. That night, I barely slept. I kept the fire going until it was just embers and sat inside my tent with my flashlight on my lap. Around 2 a.m., I heard the sound again. This time, it wasn't just one brush. It was 2 quick swipes on the back wall of the tent, like something testing the fabric. Then silence. I didn't breathe. I just held still with my heart pounding. A few minutes later, there was a short, sharp rustle in the leaves maybe 20 feet away, then nothing. I stayed awake the rest of the night, not even closing my eyes. The next morning, I packed everything up. I didn't eat, didn't make coffee. I shoved all my gear into the pack and got moving. I didn't care that I was supposed to stay another day. Something felt off and I didn't want to find out what it was. I started the hike out at sunrise. Everything was dead quiet. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my boots hitting the trail. About halfway back, I noticed something that stopped me cold again. There was a footprint, not an animal, a boot print, but it wasn't mine. I wear size 12 hiking boots with a very distinct tread. This was smaller, maybe a size 9, and more worn down. It was fresh too. The edges weren't faded, and the soil was still damp. It was pointed in the direction of my camp. I didn't see any others nearby, but I didn't stop to look. I kept moving, faster. I reached the car just before noon, sweating even though it wasn't hot. I threw my pack into the back seat and didn't even change out of my boots. I just started the car and drove. I didn't stop until I hit the highway, and even then, I kept checking my mirror like a maniac. When I got home, I unpacked everything in the garage and checked my tent closely. On the back wall, near the base, were 2 faint smudges. Not scratches or tears, just marks, like dirty hands had pressed against the fabric. I checked my cameras next. I had a small motion-activated trail cam I usually set up facing my camp for fun. The footage from the second night showed nothing. But the third night, the one with the 2 swipes, there was a clip, just 3 seconds long. At 1:58 a.m., something triggered the camera. The footage was dark and blurry, but for a second, you could see a figure standing just outside the firelight. Not close, just far enough to be hard to see clearly. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. No flashlight, no gear, just standing still, facing the tent. Then they stepped back and vanished into the darkness. I never went back to that forest again. I still go camping sometimes, but never alone anymore. And never without extra trail cams, locks on my tent zippers, and a very sharp knife close by. I don't know who that person was, or how long they had been watching me. But the scariest part is knowing how quiet they were, how careful. They didn't try to steal anything. They didn't make a sound. They just wanted me to know they were there. It was around the end of September when I decided to go on that camping trip. I remember because the leaves had just started to turn orange and red, and the air had that crisp edge that always reminds me of how close winter is. I had a long weekend coming up, and I'd been working straight for almost 2 months without a real break. My head felt full all the time, and I couldn't focus on anything for more than a few minutes. The idea of sitting in front of a screen for 3 more days just made my chest tighten. So I decided to get away from everything and head out into the woods. I picked a place I'd never been to before. I'd read about it in a forum where hikers talked about lesser-known spots, places that didn't have signs or maps or designated campgrounds. The post was from a guy who said he'd stumbled across this little clearing off a side trail up near Ridgeback Lake, about 3 hours northeast from where I lived. According to him, it was peaceful, empty, and quiet all night. That sounded exactly like what I needed. I packed light but smart. Tent, sleeping bag, a hatchet, small gas stove, enough food for 4 days even though I only planned to stay for 3. I had my knife, 2 lighters, some rope, and a steel water bottle with a built-in filter straw. I made sure my phone was fully charged and downloaded offline maps just in case. I even brought an old-school compass, because I know how fast GPS can become useless in deep woods. I wanted to unplug, but I didn't want to be stupid about it. I left early on Friday morning. The drive was smooth. I didn't stop for food or gas until I was about an hour from the trailhead. There wasn't much there, a rundown gas station with a single working pump, and a small store with dust on the shelves. I bought a small can of propane and a granola bar, even though I didn't need either. The guy behind the counter looked like he hadn't seen someone in a few hours. He didn't say anything, and I didn't either. The trailhead was hard to find, just like the post said. I had to park about a mile down the road from the official trail entrance because there wasn't a shoulder to pull off on. I grabbed my pack and started walking. The first few hours were easy, just a winding dirt trail through the forest. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No car sounds, no voices, just birds, the occasional rustling in the underbrush, and the soft sound of my boots on dirt. It was everything I wanted. Around mid-afternoon, I found the narrow trail the guy on the forum had described. It wasn't marked, but the bend in the main trail looked just like the picture he posted. I followed it. It was barely a trail at all, just flattened grass and some broken branches, like maybe a deer had passed through a few days before. I kept walking, checking my compass every now and then to make sure I was still heading north. After maybe 40 minutes of slow walking, I found it. The clearing wasn't big, maybe 20 feet across, surrounded by tall pine trees and a few low shrubs. The ground was mostly level, and there was an old fire ring made of stones in the center. It looked like no one had used it in a long time. There was some blackened wood inside, maybe from last year or even earlier. I smiled when I saw it. Felt like I'd found something secret. I set up my tent on the flattest spot I could find. Took maybe 15 minutes. After that, I set up my small camp stove on a rock and made some tea. I didn't bother cooking yet. I just sat there, staring out into the woods, listening to the wind move through the trees. It was so quiet I could hear myself breathe. That night, I ate a freeze-dried meal and a protein bar, then crawled into my sleeping bag and passed out almost instantly. I didn't wake up once. It was the best sleep I'd had in months. The second day started calm. I boiled water for coffee and sat on a fallen log, sipping slowly. I had no plans except to explore a bit and relax. Around mid-morning, I decided to follow the tree line behind the clearing and see where it led. I didn't bring my full pack, just my knife, compass, water, and a snack. I didn't go far, maybe a mile or 2. I didn't want to get lost. The trees were thicker back there, and the sunlight barely made it through the canopy. I kept an eye on my direction and always made mental notes of landmarks. Odd-shaped trees, moss patterns, broken stumps. I turned around after an hour or so and headed back. When I got back to the clearing, nothing had changed, but I noticed something strange near the fire ring. A small pile of stones had been placed just outside it. I hadn't done that. It was maybe 8 or 9 smooth rocks, stacked into a neat little tower about 6 inches tall. At first, I thought maybe I just hadn't noticed it before, but I would've. It was right in the open. I walked around the clearing, scanning for footprints. The ground was dry, covered with needles and leaves, but I didn't see anything fresh. No broken branches, no bent grass, nothing that looked out of place. I tried to shake it off, figured maybe it was old and my brain just hadn't registered it the first time. I sat down and made lunch. The rest of the day was quiet. That night, though, something woke me up. I didn't know what time it was. My phone was in my pack, and I didn't feel like reaching for it. I just remember opening my eyes and knowing something had changed. I didn't hear anything at first. Then I did. A faint snapping sound, like a twig breaking. It came from the direction of the trees, maybe 10 or 15 feet from the edge of the clearing. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't natural either. It didn't sound like an animal moving. It sounded like pressure, like someone stepping on something dry. I held my breath and listened. Nothing else for a while, just silence. But I didn't fall back asleep for a long time. I just lay there, eyes open, waiting for another sound. Eventually, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, it was morning again. I got out of the tent and walked the edge of the clearing. I didn't see anything strange. No footprints, no disturbed branches. But when I walked over to the fire ring, the pile of stones was gone. Every one of them, not scattered, not knocked over, gone. I looked around the clearing for them, thinking maybe an animal had knocked them away or kicked them. Nothing, not a single rock. That unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. It felt like someone was messing with me on purpose. I checked my gear. Nothing was missing or moved. My food was untouched, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, watching me. I thought about packing up and leaving, but part of me felt stupid. It was just a few rocks. Maybe I'd done it in my sleep and forgotten. Maybe animals carried them off one by one. I tried to convince myself of anything that made sense. I stayed a third night, mostly because I didn't want to feel like I was running away from something invisible. That night, I kept my knife in my hand, inside the sleeping bag. I lay awake for hours. I didn't hear anything for a long time. Then I did. A soft rustling, like someone walking slowly through dry grass. Then it stopped. Then another soft crunch. Closer. I sat up in the tent and froze. I didn't breathe. I waited for it to keep going, but it stopped completely. I held that position for at least 20 minutes, just listening. Nothing. I finally unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and peeked outside. The clearing looked the same. No movement, no figures, nothing in the fire ring. But when I stepped outside and walked to the far edge of the clearing with my headlamp on low, I found something. A footprint. Not deep but clear. A human footprint, bare. No shoe tread. Just the shape of a heel, arch, and toes pressed into the soft dirt near the edge. Just one. I scanned the ground with my light but didn't find another. Just the one print, facing the direction of my tent. That was enough. I packed my gear before the sun came up, took down the tent, stuffed everything into my pack, and got moving. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't make coffee. I just wanted to get back to the main trail and as far from that clearing as I could. The walk back felt longer than before. I kept checking behind me. I listened for every twig snap and every movement in the trees. Felt like the woods were breathing, like they were closing in around me. I tried to stay calm, kept checking my compass to make sure I was going the right way. I finally reached the main trail and picked up the pace. I didn't stop once. Not for water, not to rest. I didn't even look up from the trail until I saw the road in the distance. When I reached my car, I threw my pack in the back seat and locked the doors immediately. My heart was still pounding. I sat there for a while, engine off, just breathing. I looked out the window toward the trees and felt like they were staring back. I drove the whole way home without stopping. I didn't even listen to music. When I got back, I took a long shower and stood under the water until it ran cold. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that I was tired and anxious and maybe a little paranoid. But a week later, I opened my pack to clean it out, and I found something I hadn't put there. A smooth stone, about the size of a golf ball, round and gray with a faint red line running through it. It was sitting in the small pocket where I usually kept my compass. I know I didn't put it there. I emptied that pack completely before I left the clearing. I remember checking every zipper, every flap. I was 31 when I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the forest up north, near the edge of a quiet nature preserve that was about 3 hours from the nearest real town. I didn't really plan it out for any specific reason. I wasn't trying to clear my head or run from anything. I just wanted to get away from the usual noise of life, from people, from the buzzing of city lights and phones and everything that makes your chest tight even when nothing's wrong. I had a decent SUV that I'd fixed up myself, a well-worn tent that had made it through years of use, and the kind of gear you collect slowly when you go on enough weekend hikes. So I packed it all up and just left on a Thursday morning, figuring I'd spend at least 3 nights out there, maybe 4 if it felt right. The drive out was peaceful. The deeper I went, the fewer signs of people I saw. Gas stations thinned out to small-town co-ops and then to nothing. The road narrowed and got rougher until it was just gravel and packed dirt. My GPS lost signal about halfway through the final stretch, but I had marked the area on a paper map and I'd printed out directions. I don't trust technology once I'm more than 10 miles from cell towers. Too many stories of it giving out when people need it most. I pulled off onto a side trail where tire ruts dug deep into the soft earth, leading into the trees. I followed it slowly for maybe a mile before I found a flat patch where I could park the SUV and carry my gear a short distance into the brush. I didn't want to camp right beside my vehicle. I like to feel completely alone when I'm in the woods. The spot I picked was a good 100 yards into a clearing ringed by tall pines and thick undergrowth. The trees here were older than the ones closer to the road, and the whole place smelled of sap and damp bark. There were fallen logs soft with rot and moss, birds flicking from branch to branch overhead, and the distant, steady hum of insects that never stopped buzzing. Felt perfect. I pitched the tent facing a small, shallow stream about 30 feet away. The water was clean and cold, fed by snow runoff that still came down from the higher elevations. I boiled all my water anyway, even if it looked clear. I had enough food for days, and I kept my bear canister locked and far from the tent, hanging from a thick branch with cords so nothing could get into it. I made a small fire pit using stones from the stream bank and spent the first evening just sitting by the flames, watching the sky darken between the silhouettes of pine needles. There were no signs of other campers. No wrappers on the ground, no footprints, nothing. That first night, the silence out there was the kind that presses into your ears. No sirens, no car engines, just wind. I fell asleep early and didn't wake up once. The second day, I hiked several miles in a loop, trying to find a high point where I could look out over the land. I made my way up a rocky incline just past a grove of tight, clustered spruce and found a ridge that let me see for what looked like forever. No towns, no rooftops, just miles of trees, layered like ocean waves, with fog rising in the distance. It made me feel small in a way I liked. I stayed up there until the sun started to fall and made it back to camp just before full dark. I cooked some dehydrated food, added extra wood to the fire, and then just lay on my back beside the tent, staring up at the stars. It was halfway through that second night that things started to feel off. I didn't hear anything strange at first. It wasn't a sound that woke me, but a feeling. I sat up in the tent around 3 in the morning, wide awake like someone had clapped their hands beside my head. I unzipped the flap a few inches and looked out. The forest looked the same as it always did at night. Shapes of trees against blackness. A light breeze, but something in the air felt different. I couldn't explain it then, and I still can't now. It was just a sense that I wasn't alone anymore, that something had shifted. I stayed awake for about an hour just listening. At some point, I must have dozed off again, because the next thing I remember was morning light leaking into the tent walls. I tried to brush the feeling off. Maybe it was just the quiet getting to me. Maybe my brain was playing tricks on me after 2 days without hearing another person's voice. But that day, I noticed something strange a few hundred feet from camp. I had gone off into the trees to look for dry kindling and maybe spot some fresh tracks. I liked seeing signs of wildlife when I was out, but instead of elk or deer prints, I found something else. There was a patch of soil that had been disturbed, soft, loose dirt, like someone had dug a small hole and then filled it back in. At first I thought it was just a fox or a raccoon burying scraps, but the size of the patch was odd. Too wide, not deep enough for an animal den, but too even to be natural. I crouched down and poked at it with a stick, but didn't dig it up. Something about it made my stomach tighten. I walked a slow circle around the area and found a second patch like it about 30 feet away. Same shape, same size, same disturbed dirt. I didn't have a good reason to be uneasy. I told myself it could have been anything, maybe a hunter caching gear or a camper hiding trash. I kept telling myself that as I made my way back to camp. But I started noticing other little things too. My firewood pile looked smaller than I remembered. The tarp I'd folded near the tent had been shifted slightly. Not a lot, just enough that the corners weren't lined up anymore. Could have been the wind. I kept telling myself that. That night, I didn't fall asleep easily. I lay there for hours, staring at the tent ceiling, listening for anything out of place. I must have finally drifted off close to sunrise, because when I opened my eyes, the sky was already pale and the air was warming up. I stepped out of the tent and the first thing I saw was a footprint. Not mine, not a boot print, just one bare human foot, right there in the soft dirt beside the fire pit. It was long and narrow and deep enough to be fresh. The toes were pointed toward the tent. I just stood there for a full minute, not moving. I looked around the clearing, turning slowly, heart thudding in my chest. There was no one in sight, no movement in the trees. Nothing but that single footprint, like whoever made it had walked up to the tent and then vanished. I packed up camp within the hour. I didn't bother cooking anything. I stuffed my gear into the backpack, broke down the tent, and started moving fast. I kept my knife in my hand the whole time, not because I thought it would help, but because it felt like I should have something sharp between me and whatever had been watching. I didn't go back to the SUV. I figured if someone was messing with me, they might be waiting for me to do just that. Instead, I headed deeper into the forest, planning to make a wide loop around and then double back toward the trailhead from a different angle. I moved fast at first, then slower as I got deeper in. The trees got tighter, the ground steeper. I stopped only once to drink and catch my breath, and that's when I saw it again. Another bare footprint. This one was on a patch of muddy ground beside a rock outcrop, pointed in the same direction I was walking. It was fresher than the last one. By that point, I couldn't pretend anymore. Someone was out here with me. Someone walking barefoot through miles of rough terrain. Someone who wasn't making any noise, wasn't leaving any signs but those prints, and somehow had gotten close enough to my tent to leave one right beside where I'd been sleeping. I started moving faster. I checked over my shoulder constantly. Every time a branch cracked or a bird flew up suddenly, I froze. I kept expecting to see someone step out from behind a tree, or worse, nothing at all. Just feel a hand grab me from behind. I kept going until the sun dipped behind the hills. I hadn't found the road. I hadn't found my SUV. I was either turned around or deeper in than I thought. I didn't want to stop moving, but I couldn't walk blind through unfamiliar terrain at night. So I picked a flat spot on a hill and set up a fast camp. No tent, just the sleeping bag under a tarp. I didn't light a fire. I didn't eat. I just lay there in the dark with my knife clutched to my chest, eyes wide, listening. And that's when I heard them. Not animals, not the wind. Footsteps, soft ones, close. They circled my camp. I swear it. I lay there, barely breathing, as whatever it was moved just outside the range of my vision. I never saw them. I never heard them speak. Just the crunch of pine needles, the soft breaking of twigs. It went on for hours. Sometimes it would stop, then start again from a different angle. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay there with my ears straining and my muscles clenched tight. By morning, they were gone. I forced myself up, legs stiff and shaky. I didn't care about my gear anymore. I packed only what I could carry easily and left the rest. I followed the sun east until I finally saw something that made me want to cry. A piece of rusted metal half buried in dirt. It was a faded trail sign, pointing back toward the service road. I followed it, my boots dragging, my mind numb. I found the SUV just before noon. No signs of anyone around. I unlocked it, climbed in, locked the doors behind me, and sat there for a long time before starting the engine. I didn't look in the rearview mirror until I was several miles down the gravel road, back where the trees thinned and the sky opened up again. I never reported it. What would I say? I don't know why I didn't turn around when I had the chance. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was just the way the air smelled that morning. Fresh, still damp with dew, pine needles warming up under the rising sun. The silence of a place that hadn't been stepped on by many people. It was a Thursday in late October, and I had taken a week off work to camp in the Cascades. I was already deep into the wilderness by the time the trail split, and something about the way the narrow, less beaten side path disappeared into the trees made it feel like the right way to go. Not the easier way. Not the way marked with little reflective diamonds or helpful orange ribbons. But the right way. That's how I saw it at the time. I'd been solo hiking and camping for years. I wasn't a survivalist, but I knew enough how to build a proper shelter, how to hang food, how to filter water, and how to make a fire even if things were damp. I packed light but smart. My tent was one of those ultralight types, and I carried a small axe strapped to my pack, along with a knife clipped to my belt and a backup tucked inside the waistband of my pants. The terrain wasn't technical, and the weather was holding out. Cold at night, but dry. I had 5 days of food, a water filter, a GPS unit, a paper map, and a backup compass. I didn't tell many people where I was going, but I did text my brother a general idea before I left signal range. That split in the trail wasn't even on my map. I remember checking. The main path looped in a big arc and crossed back into a logging area on the other side of the ridge. That side path just wasn't on anything. Maybe it was new, maybe it was old and forgotten. It didn't look overgrown. That should have been my first red flag, but I didn't think about it at the time. I walked for another 3 or 4 hours, heading down into thicker forest where the trees grew tall and the ground grew damp. There weren't many rocks here, just deep soil, thick layers of needles, moss, and roots. I started to see small signs of animals, droppings, scratches on trees. Nothing that bothered me, just reminders that I wasn't alone out there, even if I hadn't seen another person in 2 days. My plan was to find a stream, set up camp, and stay for a night or two in the same spot. I like to move each day, but sometimes it's good to let the woods settle around you and not leave a trace behind every morning. I found a spot that afternoon. Flat ground, soft, protected by trees. There were signs a deer had been bedding there, but nothing fresh. I could hear a creek not far off. By the time I had my camp set up, the sky was turning gray. Not with clouds, just that dull shift in light that comes before sunset deep in the trees. I made a small fire and boiled water for freeze-dried chili. I remember eating slowly, listening to the wind in the branches above, watching the light fade. I slept okay that first night, even though I thought I heard movement outside the tent a few times. Little things, cracking twigs, not heavy footsteps, just the kind of sounds you can't identify. Maybe a porcupine or a raccoon. I was used to that. You wake up, hold your breath, listen, and if it doesn't get closer, you go back to sleep. That's what I did. The second time I woke up, it was closer, just outside the tent, like something brushing against the fabric. That time I sat up. I held my breath again and listened, and after a while, it was gone. In the morning, I found a few marks in the soft ground. Not paw prints, just indentations. Something had definitely come close, but I couldn't say what. It had rained lightly overnight, just enough to soften the dirt and keep the fire pit damp. I boiled water again, drank instant coffee, and decided I'd stay one more night in the same spot before moving. I wanted to explore a little, maybe follow the creek and see where it went. I packed light and headed out. The creek was maybe a 15-minute walk from camp. It wasn't wide, but it was fast-moving. Clear, cold water cutting over smooth rocks and through tight turns where the land dipped. I followed it upstream, stepping carefully over slick logs and watching for snakes. I didn't see any, just birds mostly. I didn't bring my GPS with me, which I know was a mistake, but I wasn't going far. I could follow the water right back to camp. That was the plan. I spent maybe an hour or two climbing over rocks and looking at the way the trees grew in that part of the forest. Different here, less undergrowth, quieter. I stopped when I found a metal post sticking out of the ground. Just rusted rebar, really. Nothing official. Just a post. Like someone marked a spot there years ago. Maybe old survey work, maybe something else. It didn't look new. I stood next to it and looked around, but there wasn't anything else. No tape, no ribbon, no sign. It was just there, in the middle of nowhere. When I turned back, something felt wrong. I don't mean supernatural. I don't mean ghostly. I mean, I wasn't sure which way I'd come from. I stood still for a while and tried to listen for the creek, but all I could hear was wind. No water. I started walking what I thought was the right way, but after 10 minutes, I hadn't found the stream again. Just more trees. I walked faster, looked for landmarks. A strange fallen tree I remembered climbing over, a patch of white fungus I saw earlier. But nothing looked familiar. I still wasn't panicking. Not yet. I knew I could stop, look at the sun, think it through. But clouds had moved in, and the light was diffuse now, no shadows, no direction. That's when I started to get the tight feeling in my chest. I knew I wasn't far from camp, but not far doesn't help if you're heading the wrong way. I walked faster, thinking maybe I'd loop back to the creek, but instead I found something else. A footprint. Not mine, not an animal's. A boot print, fresh. I crouched down and stared at it. Same general size as mine, maybe a little wider. Deep in the heel, light in the toe. Someone walking fast, not standing. Pointed away from me into the woods. I don't know how long I stood there looking at that boot print. The silence was thick. Not peaceful, not calm. Just heavy. I started walking again, not in the direction of the print, but at an angle, trying to cut across whatever trail that person had taken. But I didn't find more. I didn't find anything. Just more trees. More silence. By the time I finally stumbled back into my camp, the sky was dark gray and I was soaked in sweat. I had no idea how long I'd been out. My food bag was still hanging, my gear untouched. Nothing was moved, but I couldn't stop thinking about that print. Someone else was out here. Maybe a hunter. Maybe another hiker, but I hadn't seen or heard anyone in days. I didn't even see planes overhead. That night, I built the fire bigger than I normally would have. Not for warmth, for visibility, for safety, and I kept my axe inside the tent with me. I didn't sleep much. Every sound outside made my body go rigid. I kept checking my watch, waiting for morning. When it finally got light, I packed everything. I was done with this area. I didn't want to meet whoever made that boot print. I didn't want to run into something I couldn't see coming. I just wanted to get back to the trail I came from. I used my GPS and picked a route that should have brought me back to the original fork in the trail. It wasn't the way I came in, but it should have looped around. That's what the topo map showed. I kept moving all day, barely stopping for water, not eating until evening. But the trail never came. It wasn't there. My GPS showed I was on top of it, but there was no path, no clearing, no sign, just trees. I made camp that night in a tight cluster of rocks near a dry stream bed. I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to be seen. That was the worst night. I didn't sleep at all. I heard movement, definite movement, not just animals. I know what squirrels and raccoons sound like. This was heavier, slower, more deliberate. Once, I heard it just feet away from my tent. I could hear breathing, just slow, quiet human breathing. I held the axe so tight my hand cramped. I didn't move until morning, and when I came out of the tent, there was something waiting. Not a person, not an animal, a shape made out of sticks, hanging from a branch above my tent. It wasn't fancy, just 3 sticks tied with old shoelace or something, like a triangle. But someone put it there, while I was inside, while I was holding that axe and trying not to breathe. Someone had been right above me. I didn't stop to eat. I didn't stop to check my map. I just started walking in a straight line using my compass, heading due west. I knew eventually I'd hit a road. Any road. It might take a day or two, but I couldn't stay there anymore. I just walked. By late afternoon, I started to hear something, faint at first, then clearer. Machinery, chainsaws, distant but real. I followed the sound. Took hours and I had to bushwhack through some thick undergrowth, but I found a clearing. Then a dirt road. Then two men standing next to a truck, wearing safety vests. They looked surprised when they saw me. I must have looked like hell. They gave me water, asked if I was okay. I told them I got lost. It was late summer when I decided to go camping alone in a forest that was neither too far nor too close from the city where I lived. I wanted a break from the noise, from people, from everything. The idea was simple. Pack some food, a tent, a sleeping bag, and enough water, then disappear into the trees for a few days. I had been camping before, but never alone for this long. I was confident, sure I could handle it. The forest I chose was popular among hikers and campers during the day, but was quiet at night. It had no big rivers or lakes nearby, just thick trees and trails that cut through them. I left early in the morning, carrying my backpack and the small tent I had bought. The sky was clear and blue, birds were singing, and the air smelled fresh. I walked for about 2 hours, following the trail deeper into the forest. The sun was warm, but there was a cool breeze that made the walk comfortable. I found a small clearing that seemed perfect for setting up camp. It was flat, with soft soil and surrounded by tall pine trees. There was enough space to pitch my tent and keep a small fire pit. I noticed the ground had some dry leaves and small twigs, but nothing too dangerous. I started setting up the tent, taking my time to make sure it was tight and secure. After the tent was ready, I gathered wood for the fire. I found dry branches and some bigger logs nearby. I stacked them carefully and lit the fire with a small lighter I carried. The fire crackled and sent tiny sparks into the air. I felt calm watching the flames and the smoke rising. I prepared a simple meal, some canned beans and bread. I ate slowly, enjoying the quiet and the smell of burning wood. As the sun began to set, the forest changed. Shadows grew longer, the birds stopped singing, and the forest fell silent except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. The colors of the trees and the sky became darker, and a deep blue settled over everything. I went inside the tent to get ready for the night. I had a small flashlight, a knife, and my phone, though I wasn't sure if I had signal that far in. I set the phone on airplane mode to save battery. I checked the map one last time, making sure I knew the way back to the trail in the morning. I thought about the stories I had heard about camping alone, about dangers like wild animals or getting lost, but I told myself I was prepared. I had been careful. I trusted my instincts. Night came, and with it, the forest's true quietness. It was darker than I expected. The moon was thin and high, giving little light. I lay inside the tent, wrapped in my sleeping bag, listening to the small sounds outside. The wind in the trees, the snap of twigs under something's weight, maybe a small animal moving around. At first, these sounds felt normal, natural. But then I started noticing something different. There was a noise that didn't fit, the sound of footsteps. Slow, heavy, but not close. They came and went, disappearing and returning in irregular patterns. They weren't the light, quick steps of a deer or squirrel. These were heavier, deliberate. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind playing tricks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving around my camp. The footsteps never got closer to the tent, but they never went away either. They seemed to circle. I stayed awake for hours, holding my flashlight ready. The forest seemed alive with eyes watching me. Every now and then, a branch cracked, and I flashed the light toward it, but I never saw anything. The dark was too thick, and the trees too close. My heart beat faster each time. I wanted to call someone, but the phone was useless. The battery was dying, and there was no signal anyway. At some point, the footsteps stopped. The silence returned, heavy and complete. I closed my eyes, trying to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. Then I heard something else. A low growl, distant but clear. It was an animal, no doubt, but it was different from any I had heard before. It sounded like a predator, big and angry. I grabbed my knife, ready to defend myself, though I doubted it would do much good. I whispered to myself that I wasn't afraid, that I was safe inside the tent, but the fear was there. The growling went on for some minutes and then stopped abruptly. The forest became quiet again. I tried to convince myself that the animal was far away and wouldn't bother me. Still, I decided to stay awake, sitting against the tent wall with the flashlight and knife in hand. The night slowly passed with no other sounds or movements, just the occasional breeze and the crackling fire that I kept alive. When the first light of dawn appeared, I felt relief. The forest looked different in the daylight, less threatening, more familiar. I packed up my tent quickly and decided to take a different route back to the main trail. I wanted to avoid the area where I had felt the footsteps and heard the growl. As I walked, I kept scanning the trees and the bushes around me, expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing unusual. Birds began singing again, and small animals darted through the underbrush. On my way back, I noticed strange signs, broken branches, deep footprints in the mud that were not like any animal tracks I knew. They were large, almost human, but with an odd shape. The footprints led away from the camp area into the thicker part of the forest. My heart sank. I stopped and looked around, realizing I had been watched. I knew someone or something had been close to me last night, close enough to circle my tent without me seeing it. I followed the footprints for a short distance, then decided to turn back. I wasn't interested in meeting whatever had made them. The trail back was long but peaceful. When I finally reached my car, parked at the edge of the forest, I felt a wave of exhaustion and relief wash over me. I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. That night and the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what happened. I told myself that it was probably a wild animal or maybe someone else camping nearby. But I knew it was more than that. The footsteps, the growling, the strange tracks, they didn't belong to any normal forest creature. I never found out what exactly it was, but I never went camping alone again. Looking back, I realized that the scariest part wasn't the darkness or the noises. It was the feeling that something was deliberately watching me, following me, and waiting. The forest had a secret that night, and I was lucky to walk away from it. That experience changed how I see nature and solitude. It's beautiful and peaceful during the day, but at night, it can be something else entirely, something wild and unknowable. And sometimes you are not alone, even when you think you are. I had always liked camping alone. There was something about being out in the wilderness, away from the noise and people, that made me feel peaceful. I could clear my head and enjoy nature on my own terms. That summer, I decided to go camping deep in a national forest I had never visited before. The place was known for its dense woods, rough trails, and little human traffic. I figured it was perfect for a few days of solitude. I packed my gear carefully. I had my sturdy backpack, a tent, a sleeping bag rated for cool nights, a small stove, enough food for 3 days, a first aid kit, a map of the area, and a compass. I also took extra batteries for my flashlight and a portable phone charger, even though I expected little to no signal out there. I wanted to be prepared for anything. I set out early in the morning, driving to the trailhead that led into the forest. The air was fresh and cool as I unloaded my gear and slung the pack over my shoulders. The trail was narrow and rough, covered with roots and fallen leaves. The sun filtered through the tall trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground. It felt like I was stepping into another world. I felt calm and excited. The hike to my chosen campsite took longer than I expected. The trail was steeper in some places, and I had to navigate around fallen trees. I stopped occasionally to rest, drink water, and admire the quiet beauty of the forest. Birds sang overhead, and I caught glimpses of squirrels and rabbits darting through the underbrush. The forest was thick, and the tall pines and oaks blocked much of the sky. The smell of pine needles and damp earth was strong. After several hours, I reached a small clearing beside a slow-moving creek. It was perfect. There was enough flat ground to pitch my tent, and the creek provided water I could filter. I set up camp carefully, staking my tent securely and arranging my gear inside. I built a small fire pit from stones I found nearby and gathered dry wood for a fire. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm orange glow through the trees. I boiled water on my stove and made a simple dinner of rice and canned beans. I ate slowly, listening to the sounds around me. The trickle of the creek, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional call of a distant bird. As night fell, I started a small campfire. The flames flickered and cracked, sending shadows dancing among the trees. I felt peaceful and content. But as the night grew darker, something started to change. The forest seemed to grow quieter. The usual sounds of animals and insects faded until I heard only the occasional snap of a twig or rustle in the brush. I kept my flashlight close and my knife within reach just in case. I told myself I was being silly, but a tiny part of me felt uneasy. I stayed up late by the fire, watching the flames burn low. Then I decided to crawl into my tent and sleep. The air was cooler now, and I zipped the tent closed. I tried to calm my mind, focusing on the gentle sound of the creek nearby. It was hard to fall asleep, but eventually, I drifted off. Around midnight, I woke suddenly. Something had disturbed my sleep. I heard a faint noise outside the tent, a soft crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart pounded. I sat up carefully, trying not to make any noise. I switched on my flashlight and aimed the beam through the tent fabric toward the opening. The beam caught a shape moving just outside the tent. It was dark, but definitely humanoid. My breath caught. I froze, trying to make sense of what I saw. It wasn't an animal. The figure didn't run or hide. It just stood still for a moment and then disappeared into the shadows beyond the firelight. I stayed inside the tent, tense and alert. I thought about packing up and leaving, but it was the middle of the night, and moving quietly in the dark seemed even more dangerous. Instead, I gripped my knife tightly and waited, eyes wide open. The footsteps came again, this time circling the campsite slowly, stepping on sticks and dry leaves. Whoever or whatever it was moving cautiously, as if trying not to be heard. I could tell it was big enough to be a person. Hours passed. The sounds gradually faded. Dawn came slowly, the sky lightening to a soft gray before pink. I felt exhausted but relieved. I unzipped the tent and looked outside carefully. There was no sign of anyone else, but near the edge of the clearing, I noticed fresh footprints in the soft soil. They were definitely human, and they circled my campsite in a rough loop. My mind raced. Who had been out there? What did they want? Was it just a hiker or someone with bad intentions? I felt vulnerable more so than ever before. I knew I couldn't stay here another night. I packed my camp quickly but carefully, not wanting to leave any trace behind. As I prepared to leave, I scanned the woods around me. The forest seemed normal again, quiet and still. I started hiking back the way I came, sticking to the trail as much as I could. But as I walked, I kept hearing noises behind me, branches snapping, leaves crunching. I stopped and turned, shining my flashlight back into the trees. Nothing, but the feeling of being followed was strong. I walked faster. The trail was familiar now, and I hoped to reach my car before anything happened. My heart was pounding harder with every step. I tried to stay calm and remind myself that the forest was full of wildlife and normal sounds. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching me. After about an hour, I finally saw the parking area through the trees. My car was there, exactly where I left it. Relief flooded me, but I kept looking around as I approached. The forest seemed normal, peaceful. I unlocked the door and slid inside. I locked the doors immediately and sat for a moment, breathing hard. I glanced at the woods one last time before starting the engine. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I noticed something strange in the side mirror. A figure standing just inside the tree line, watching me. It was hard to make out, but it was a man. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring as my car disappeared down the road. I drove quickly but carefully, heading back toward the nearest town. My mind replayed everything: the footprints, the footsteps at night, the silent watcher. I realized that I had been lucky. Whoever that was had been close enough to threaten me but had not attacked. I thought about what could have happened if I had been less alert. When I finally reached a gas station in town, I went inside and told the clerk about the strange noises and the figure in the woods. They nodded knowingly and told me that area had a reputation for occasional trespassers. People who sometimes hid in the woods watching campers or hikers. Some were just hunters or campers themselves, but others were less friendly. I called the park rangers to report what I saw. They took my information seriously and said they would increase patrols. I was glad I had contacted them, hoping no one else would have to go through what I did. That night, safe in my own bed at home, I thought about the trip. I had wanted peace and solitude, but instead, I had faced something far more unsettling. The knowledge that people could be lurking in the woods, watching silently, with unknown intentions. Camping had always been a way to connect with nature for me. But after this experience, I understood that nature included not just animals and trees, but people with their own secrets and dangers. The forest was not always safe. From then on, I never went camping alone in remote areas without telling someone exactly where I was going. I started carrying a whistle and a small pepper spray canister, and I always made sure to set up camp in spots where I could see clearly around me. I didn't want to be scared away from the outdoors forever, but I learned that respect and caution were necessary. The wilderness could be beautiful and peaceful, but it could also hide dangers far more real than any ghost story. Looking back, I know I was lucky. The person watching me never came closer, never showed themselves clearly. Maybe they were just curious or lonely. Maybe they were worse. I will never know. But that summer, deep in the forest, I learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the scariest thing out there is not a ghost or a monster, but another person, silent and unseen, waiting just beyond the edge of your firelight. / I remember that camping trip like it was yesterday, even though it happened years ago. It was supposed to be a simple getaway. Just me, my backpack, and the wilderness for a few days. No distractions, no noise, just the quiet of the forest and the stars above. I picked a spot I'd never been to before, deep in a national park that was known for being wild and mostly untouched. The kind of place where you don't run into many people, if any at all. The drive-in was long, twisting through narrow mountain roads lined with thick trees on either side. When I finally reached the trailhead, I took a deep breath and started hiking. The air was crisp and clean, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional bird call. I carried a heavy pack with the basics: tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, and a small stove. I didn't expect to need much more. I wanted to keep it simple. After a few hours, the trail grew steeper and rockier. The trees got taller and thicker, their branches weaving overhead like a dense green roof. The sunlight dimmed, and the temperature dropped noticeably. I found a small clearing near a creek that trickled quietly through the woods. It seemed like the perfect spot to set up camp for the night. The first thing I did was pitch my tent on a flat patch of ground, away from the creek, but close enough to hear the water's soothing flow. I gathered firewood, dry sticks and branches that cracked and popped when lit, and built a small campfire. The smell of burning wood mixed with the fresh scent of pine filled the air. I cooked a simple meal, then settled down beside the fire with a cup of hot coffee, watching the flames dance and the shadows flicker on the trees. Night came fast in those woods. The sun slipped below the horizon, and darkness wrapped around everything like a heavy blanket. The stars came out, shining bright and clear. The forest noises changed. The chirping birds were replaced by the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, and the occasional hoot of an owl. I felt peaceful but alert, knowing I was alone and deep in the wild. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. The silence in the tent was too complete, broken only by a faint scratching noise somewhere outside. My heart beat a little faster, but I told myself it was probably just a small animal, a raccoon or a squirrel maybe. Still, I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent quietly. The beam swept across the trees, bushes, and rocks, but I saw nothing. The scratching stopped, but then there was a low rustling sound coming from the direction of the creek. I stayed still, listening closely. The sound moved closer and then stopped again. I couldn't see anything, but the feeling of being watched started to creep in. I decided to close the tent and try to sleep again, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. The next day was uneventful, or so I thought. I hiked a little further along the trail, enjoying the views from higher up. The forest was beautiful. Tall fir trees, moss-covered rocks, and the smell of damp earth everywhere. I found some wild berries growing near a patch of sunlight and picked a few to eat. They were sweet and tart, a nice treat. When I got back to camp, I noticed something strange. My firewood pile had been disturbed. Some of the sticks were moved, and a few had been broken in half. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe an animal had rummaged through it while I was gone. But then I saw footprints in the dirt near my tent. Big, heavy prints that didn't look like any animal I knew. They were too large and had a shape that reminded me of boots. That's when I started feeling uneasy. I'm not someone who scares easily, but the idea that someone or something had been near my camp while I was gone sent a chill down my spine. I double-checked my gear, made sure everything was packed away safely, and decided to keep my knife handy just in case. That night, I tried to stay calm. I ate a quick dinner and sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The forest was quiet again, but I kept hearing little noises, branches snapping, leaves rustling. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow moving between the trees, but when I shined my flashlight that way, nothing was there. Around 2 a.m., the scratching noise came back, louder this time. It wasn't just one spot anymore. It seemed to be all around the tent, circling. My skin crawled as the sound moved from left to right, like something was pacing. I sat up, heart pounding, and grabbed my flashlight and knife. I unzipped the tent slowly and shone the light outside. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the woods looked peaceful, but my instincts told me otherwise. Suddenly, I caught a glimpse of a figure standing just at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the dark. It didn't move, just watched me. I froze. The figure was tall and broad, wearing a dark jacket and boots. There was no face visible, only the outline of a person standing still. My mind raced, thinking about the footprints I saw earlier. I snapped on the flashlight, and the figure disappeared into the trees. I called out, but there was no answer. I gathered my things quickly, extinguished the fire completely, and decided to leave at first light. The hike back was tense. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure again. The forest seemed different now, quieter, heavier. The trail was slippery in places, and my legs were tired from the steep climb down. When I finally reached the parking lot, the sight of cars and people felt like a relief. Later, I learned from a ranger that the area had seen reports of trespassers and hunters who didn't always follow the rules. They sometimes stayed hidden in the woods, watching campers, looking for trouble or just wanting to scare people off. The footprints and figure I saw were probably one of those people. That trip stayed with me for a long time, the feeling of being watched, the quiet menace lurking just out of sight. It reminded me that the wilderness isn't just about nature. Sometimes the scariest things are the ones made by humans. Even in the middle of nowhere, you're not always alone, and some dangers don't come from animals or the wild, but from other people who don't belong there. I never went back to that spot again, and I always make sure to tell others to be careful, to trust their instincts, and to remember that not all dangers are obvious or explained by simple stories. Some are just real, raw, and waiting quietly in the shadows. I was 26 when I went on that camping trip, and it's still something I think about every time I'm alone in the woods. It was meant to be a short break, just a few days out in nature to clear my head, get away from the city noise, the screens, the traffic, the routine. I was tired of waking up every day to the same schedule, tired of emails, tired of sitting behind a desk while my body got softer and my mind got duller. I wanted to feel something real again. I had done a few hikes in the past, camped a couple of times with friends, but never anything deep or solo. I figured I was due, so I started planning it out slowly. I read blogs, checked maps, saved photos, and made lists of gear I'd need. I wanted to do it right, I picked a place about 6 hours from where I lived, up north, near the state border. It wasn't a park or a popular trail. It was a patch of forest I'd read about on a forum, not fully wild, but not commercial either. The kind of spot that sees hunters in fall and maybe the odd fisherman or backpacker in summer. Most people skipped it because it didn't have official campsites or rangers. That's what drew me to it. I wanted quiet. I wanted to feel like I was the only person in 100 miles. I packed over a couple of days, checked the weather, and left on a Thursday morning. I brought a canvas tent, my old backpacking stove, some freeze-dried meals, a basic med kit, flashlight, knife, a water filter, 2 full bottles, a thick sleeping bag, extra layers, a small hatchet, and a few other essentials. I didn't bring a gun. I thought about it, even borrowed one briefly, but I gave it back before the trip. I didn't feel comfortable carrying something I didn't know how to use properly, and I told myself I wouldn't need it anyway. It was just a short trip, 2, maybe 3 nights. I wasn't going to be doing anything dangerous, just camping, just quiet. The drive up was smooth, empty highways, light sun through a thin cloud layer, and a light breeze. It was early fall, so the trees were just starting to shift color. That part of the country is beautiful that time of year. Yellows and oranges bleeding into deep green hills, rivers moving slow and calm, leaves skipping across the road in the wind. I got to the dirt road that led into the forest around 1 in the afternoon, stopped to double-check the map I'd printed, then drove another 30 minutes into the woods. The road wasn't really made for a small sedan like mine, but I took it slow and kept an eye out for large rocks and dips. The trees got thicker as I went in, branches sometimes touching both sides of the car. There were no signs, no markers, nothing but trees and silence. I passed a rusted metal gate that was already open and kept going another mile until the road ended in a wide clearing where it looked like others had camped before. Bits of scorched wood, some crushed beer cans, a couple of tire tracks. But no one was there now. Just quiet, wind in the trees, and the occasional bird call. I parked the car to the side, took a slow breath, and started unloading. I didn't plan to camp right by the car. I wanted to go further in, maybe half a mile or so, enough to feel properly cut off. I strapped everything I needed to my pack, double-checked my supplies, and locked the car. I had no cell service, which I expected. I left a note on the dash with the date and a rough plan of my route, just in case someone ever needed to find me. Then I started walking. The trail wasn't marked, but it was easy to follow at first. Just a worn footpath through tall trees and brush, with old footprints and bits of trash here and there. I passed a stream within the first 10 minutes, took a few sips from it using my filter, then kept going. After a while, the path narrowed, then split. I took the one that sloped up slightly toward a ridge I'd seen on the map. I wanted to camp somewhere with a view, maybe near a ledge or a clearing. The air was cooler up there, and I felt good. My legs were fresh, my lungs open, and for a while it felt like I'd made the right decision coming out here. I found the spot just before 4, a small patch of flat ground near a rock outcrop that looked down on a wide stretch of trees. It was perfect. There were no signs of other people, no wrappers or bottle caps or burnt logs, just dirt, moss, and space. I set up the tent, pounded in the stakes, and started gathering dry branches from the nearby woods. I didn't plan to have a fire every night, but I wanted one that first evening. Something about fire in the dark makes you feel grounded. I built a ring of rocks, lit some kindling, and cooked a meal over the flames. Tasted fine, bland but filling. Afterward, I sat by the fire with a small tin mug of tea and let myself sink into the silence. The stars came out slowly, and with no light around, they were bright and endless. I watched the sky for what felt like an hour before finally crawling into the tent, zipping myself into the bag, and drifting off to sleep. The first night was fine. Some rustling in the woods, the kind of stuff you expect. Raccoons or deer, maybe a fox. I woke up a couple of times but didn't hear anything strange, just the wind and creaks of trees. The next morning, I boiled water for oatmeal, packed a small day bag, and went exploring. I followed the ridge for a while, took some photos, found a few interesting rock formations, and even saw a group of wild turkeys moving through the brush. Nothing felt off. Not yet. I made it back to camp by late afternoon, collected more wood, and sat down for another simple dinner. It was that second night when things changed. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. Not from a dream, not from discomfort, but from a sound. A deliberate, sharp sound. A branch snapping. Not like something falling from a tree, not the random crackle of twigs under wind. This was slower, heavier, like a footstep. I froze in my bag, eyes wide open in the dark. The fire had gone out hours ago. My flashlight was within reach, but I didn't grab it. I just stayed still, listening. My heart was pounding. I waited, holding my breath. Then I heard it again. Closer. Another crack. Then the sound of something brushing against the tent. Not hard, not like it was being pushed, just a light scrape, a fingertip on fabric. My hand moved slowly to the knife I kept next to my sleeping bag. I wrapped my fingers around the handle and stayed there for what felt like 10 full minutes, trying to listen, trying to breathe quietly. Nothing else happened, just silence again. I must have stayed like that for over an hour, my body stiff, my mind racing, before I finally drifted off again, still holding the knife. When morning came, I got out of the tent fast. I checked the area. I didn't see anything at first. Then, about 20 feet from my tent, I saw something odd. A boot print, not mine. It was deep, fresher than mine, and pointed toward my camp. I walked in a slow circle, scanning the dirt and leaves. I found 3 more prints, all coming in, none going out. That's when my stomach dropped. Someone had been there. Someone had walked into my camp while I slept. Maybe they had walked off in a different direction and I just couldn't see the prints. Maybe, but I couldn't prove it. I packed everything up quickly. I didn't want to be there anymore. I wanted to go back to the car and leave. I figured I could make it back by mid-afternoon. I didn't eat breakfast. I just packed, shouldered my bag, and started walking. That's when I realized something was wrong with the trail. The path I'd used to come in wasn't the same. The trees looked familiar, but the trail was harder to follow now. It felt off. I checked the map, looked for landmarks, and tried to retrace my steps. After an hour, I realized I wasn't going the right way. I was too far east. I tried to cut back west, toward the stream I remembered. I walked faster, then slower when I got winded, then faster again when I heard a sound behind me. Another snap, a branch. I turned fast, but nothing was there, just trees. I kept moving. Around noon, I found a shredded backpack, torn, faded, half buried in dirt. It looked old, like it had been there a year or more. Inside were a few rusted tools, a broken lighter, a moldy notebook. I left it alone. I didn't like being near it. By 2, I still hadn't found the stream. My water was low. I sat down under a tree, poured a bit into the mug, and sipped slowly. I felt dizzy. I looked around, trying to figure out what I had missed, why the trail had changed. That's when I saw it. Far in the trees, maybe 100 feet away, something moved. Person, just standing there, half behind a trunk. They weren't walking. They were watching. I couldn't see the face, just the shape. Dark jacket, tall, still. I blinked and they were gone. I stood up fast, grabbed my pack, and started walking again. No more breaks. I didn't care if I followed the right path anymore. I just wanted to move, get distance. It wasn't until almost 5 that I found the old dirt road again. My legs were shaking. My back hurt. My shirt was soaked through. I followed the road toward where I had parked. I saw tire tracks, then a crushed soda can I remembered passing on the way in. That gave me hope. I kept going faster now. But when I reached the clearing, I had been planning that solo camping trip for nearly a year before I finally got the time off work to do it. My job had been draining the life out of me, and I was sick of city noise, constant emails, and people everywhere. I didn't want to go to a campground with running water and other campers parked 10 feet away. I wanted the real thing, no cell service, no one nearby, just me and the woods. I found a spot deep in northern Idaho that I'd read about in a few old backpacking forums. Remote, hard to access, and not on any official trail maps. That was exactly what I wanted. I spent 3 weeks prepping. I bought a good ultralight tent, a water filtration system, bear spray, a new backpack, and a compact stove. I trained with the gear in the small wooded area behind my apartment complex. I mapped out the trailhead from satellite images, saved GPS pins for emergency spots, and printed out a physical map in case my devices failed. I wasn't stupid. I knew solo hiking came with risks, so I left my full itinerary with my brother and told him I'd check in with a satellite text when I got back in 5 days. I drove out there early in the morning, leaving before sunrise. The last town before the trailhead was tiny, just a gas station and a general store with dusty shelves. I filled up the tank, bought some last-minute snacks, and made sure everything in my backpack was strapped tight. The road turned to gravel for the last hour, winding through pine forest and rocky slopes, climbing slowly toward the base of a mountain ridge. When I finally parked, I was alone. Not a single other car. The trailhead wasn't even marked. I had to check the tree line a few times before I found the barely visible trail, just a depression in the brush where others had walked before. I took one last look at my truck, locked it, hoisted my pack, and started walking. The first few hours were quiet. The trail was steep and narrow, and the trees were thick. No wind, no sound other than my footsteps and the occasional chirp of birds. I felt good, strong, focused. After about 7 miles in, I found a small flat clearing next to a creek and decided to make that my first camp. I dropped my gear, filtered water, and set up the tent while the sun lowered through the trees. I made a hot meal of rice and beans and sat back against a log, just listening. The silence was exactly what I needed. No cars, no voices, no buzzing from streetlights or neighbors, just air and trees. That night was colder than I expected, and I woke up a few times shivering even though I had a good sleeping bag. At one point, probably around 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard a noise outside the tent that made my chest tighten. It wasn't an animal sound. It was a metallic clink, brief but sharp, like metal hitting stone. I stayed completely still, every muscle tense, listening. Nothing followed it. No footsteps, no growl, not even a rustle. I lay awake for what felt like an hour, ears straining. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep again, because I woke up with light coming through the tent. The next day, I pressed farther in, deeper into the woods, heading toward a ridge I'd marked on the map. It was harder than the first day. The trail was more overgrown, and several times I had to use the GPS to realign myself. Around mid-afternoon, I found a small stone formation that looked unnatural. 5 rocks stacked on top of each other, not far off the trail. At first, I figured it was just a marker left by some other hiker, but it didn't match the kind of cairns people normally leave. It looked older somehow, and the moss growing on the rocks didn't match how recently they'd been moved. I walked past it and tried not to think too much about it. That night, I camped in a small gulch near a dried-out creek bed. It was quiet again, too quiet. There were no crickets, no owls. I found myself wishing for even the faintest hum of insects. I made another meal, logged my coordinates into my notebook, and sat in the tent journaling until my headlamp battery started to fade. Sometime past midnight, I woke up to a soft crunch outside the tent. Not fast, not loud, just one single crunch, like a boot pressing slowly into dead leaves. I froze again the same way I had the night before. I didn't even breathe for a moment. My hand went to the bear spray beside me. I stayed like that for nearly 15 minutes. Nothing else happened. No other steps, no sounds. I finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent just an inch and peek outside with my flashlight. There was nothing, but when I looked at the spot where I'd stored my food, the small rope I'd used to hang the bag from a tree limb had been cut. Not snapped, not torn, cut cleanly. The food bag was on the ground, still tied, but the rope had been sliced through like someone used a knife. That chilled me. Bears don't cut ropes. Neither do raccoons. My heart was pounding as I scanned the woods with the flashlight, but again, I saw nothing. No movement, no noise, no sign of who or what had done it. I gathered the food bag, tied it again with a backup rope, and stayed awake the rest of the night. In the morning, I found boot prints, human prints, not mine. They were faint, but visible in the soft dirt near the edge of the creek. They led away from the camp and vanished into the woods. I kept staring at them, trying to make sense of it. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail. No other cars. No fire rings or signs of other campers. I told myself maybe it was an old track. Maybe someone came through weeks ago. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I should have left then. I know that now. I should have packed up and hiked back the way I came. But I didn't. I felt stubborn, like I had something to prove. I had told myself I'd stay 5 days, and it was only day 3. I told myself I was being paranoid. People get scared in the woods all the time. Maybe the rope had frayed. Maybe I'd made the footprints without realizing. So I kept going. Day 3 took me to the ridge. The climb was brutal, all loose rocks and switchbacks. I made it up by early afternoon and found an open spot with a wide view of the surrounding forest. The trees rolled out in every direction like a green ocean. No sign of roads, houses, or anything human. I felt a little better up there, being able to see for once. I made camp at the top, next to a cluster of boulders that blocked the wind. I set up the tent and made my meal as the sun went down. That night, I didn't sleep. I heard movement again. This time it was slower, heavier, several distinct steps. Not running, not sprinting, but not cautious either. Like someone walking directly toward me, knowing I was there. I didn't dare move. I lay there in my sleeping bag, clutching the bear spray, listening to my own breath. I could hear them circling the tent. Crunch, pause, crunch, another pause, then a long silence. Then, just as suddenly, the sound of something being dragged, like a stick or a branch being pulled along the dirt. It moved off into the trees and faded. When morning came, I opened the tent and checked everything. The food bag was untouched, still hanging. My pack was fine, but there were new footprints. More than one set. 3 different sets, at least. All human, all barefoot. The prints circled the tent, some going right up to the entrance. My mouth went dry. I hadn't seen a single person in 3 days, but now I knew there were people out there. More than one, watching me, coming close while I slept. I packed everything in record time and started moving. I didn't eat, didn't refill water, just started hiking down the far side of the ridge. I didn't want to go back the way I came. I had a backup route on the map that led down to a Forest Service road, another 14 miles south. It wasn't maintained, but it would take me out to where I could find help. I kept checking over my shoulder every few minutes, expecting to see someone behind me. Around mid-afternoon, I found another stack of stones. This one was different. The stones weren't stacked vertically, they were arranged in a circle. In the middle was a small pile of animal bones. Tiny ones, cleaned, arranged deliberately. I didn't go near it. I just kept walking. The trail started to vanish as the trees grew thicker. There was no sign anyone had hiked this way in years. I had to bushwhack, using the compass and GPS to stay on track. Every few hundred feet I'd stop and listen, but there was no sound, not even birds. As the sun started to dip low, I found an old logging road and followed it until I reached a collapsed cabin, just off the path. The roof had caved in, the walls were leaning. I almost kept walking, but I needed shelter for the night. I cleared out part of the floor, set up the tent inside what was left of the cabin, and used the walls as a windbreak. I didn't cook. I didn't make noise. I just drank water and lay there in silence. That night was the worst. I woke to the sound of something hitting the wall outside. Not hard, just a tap. Then again. Then a scraping sound, like something being dragged slowly across the wood. I held my breath, eyes wide open in the dark. Then the tapping moved, now on the other wall. Then on the roof. Then silence. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps again. This time they were inside the... I was never someone who liked camping too much, but for some reason, I kept doing it. Maybe it was the way it forced me to disconnect from everything, or maybe I was just trying to prove something to myself. I didn't grow up in a very outdoorsy family. We weren't poor or anything, but we lived in a city apartment, and vacations usually meant hotels and guided tours, not tents and firewood. But something about getting older made me want to experience the kind of things I'd only seen in movies. So when I turned 27 and had some time off work, I decided to take a solo camping trip. I thought if I was going to do it, I'd do it alone, without distractions, without anyone to lean on. I wanted it to be something real. I chose a place I'd never been to before. It was a small forest preserve about 4 hours from where I lived. It wasn't a national park or anything like that, which I thought would make it less crowded and maybe a little more peaceful. I found it on a small hiking blog where someone talked about how quiet it was, how it didn't get many visitors, how it had the stillness that made it feel like time stopped. That sounded perfect to me. I wanted something quiet, something untouched, something I could sit in for days and just be alone. I packed everything I thought I would need: tent, sleeping bag, water filters, food, headlamp, knife, a flare gun just in case, even a small camping stove. I planned for 5 days. I marked a spot near the center of the forest preserve that looked isolated enough but still not too deep in the woods. There was a small lake nearby, which meant I could filter water and clean myself up if I needed to. I didn't tell too many people about my trip, just left a general note with my brother about where I was going and when I'd be back. I didn't think much of it. I wasn't going to do anything risky, and I wasn't planning on going far off the trails. It was supposed to be relaxing, a break from people, from work, from everything that was eating at me. The first day went exactly how I imagined it. I parked my car at the small gravel lot near the trailhead, double-checked all my gear, then started the slow hike into the forest. The trail was barely marked, just a few faded wooden signs that looked like no one had touched them in years. I didn't see anyone on the way in. No hikers, no rangers, nothing. It didn't bother me, though. That was part of the plan. Took me a few hours to reach the spot I had picked out. There was a clearing with enough flat ground to pitch my tent, and from there I could see the lake through the trees. I set up camp, took my time with everything, checked and rechecked my gear. I cooked a simple meal on the stove and sat on a fallen log while I ate. I watched the sun go down behind the trees, listened to the forest come alive with bugs and frogs and whatever else was out there. It was peaceful. It was exactly what I wanted. I remember thinking this was probably the best idea I'd had in years. That night, I barely slept. Not because anything was wrong, but just because it was all new. Every sound made me alert. The crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the splash of something in the water nearby. I kept sitting up and listening, trying to figure out what things were. I had bear spray, but I wasn't really worried about that. This part of the forest didn't have much in the way of big animals. Mostly deer, raccoons, maybe the odd fox. Still, it's different when you're alone out there. You feel every second pass slowly. Time stretches out and feels heavier. But I eventually drifted off. The second day was slow and quiet. I made breakfast, then walked around the area to get familiar with it. I followed the lake's edge for a while, found a few deer tracks, and even saw a beaver dam on the far side. I kept close to camp though. I didn't want to get lost, and I didn't have any GPS signal out there. I had a paper map and a compass, but I figured there was no reason to go far. I spent most of the day reading, lying in the sun, and doing nothing at all. I started to feel like my brain was slowing down in a good way, like the noise of regular life was fading. I barely thought about work or money or anything else that usually sat heavy on me. I felt calm. I ate early that evening, watched the light change on the water, and thought maybe I could get used to this kind of quiet. That night, something changed. It started out normal, same forest sounds, same rhythm. But sometime after midnight, I heard something that didn't fit. It was distant at first. A thud, then another. Heavy, slow, not like a branch falling or a raccoon digging. It had weight to it, like something big walking. I sat up in my tent and listened. Came again, thud, thud, pause. Then nothing. The forest went quiet. Too quiet. Like when a predator shows up and everything else hides. I didn't move. I just sat there and listened for a long time. Then it was back. Thud, crack, pause. It didn't sound close, maybe a few 100 feet away, but it was moving slowly, like it wasn't in a hurry. I grabbed my knife and my headlamp, but didn't turn it on. I didn't want to light up the inside of my tent. I sat still, trying to slow my breathing, trying to understand what I was hearing. After a while, the sounds faded. It moved off, deeper into the woods or maybe down toward the lake. I don't know. I stayed awake the rest of the night, barely blinking. The next morning, I checked around my camp. I didn't see anything. No tracks, no broken branches, no signs of anything big moving through. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was a deer. Maybe it was my mind making things louder than they were. I hadn't slept well. I was already jumpy, but something about it didn't feel right. It wasn't just the sound. It was the way the forest went quiet afterward, like something had scared it. I thought about leaving, just packing up and hiking out, but I told myself not to overreact. I had supplies, I wasn't hurt, and nothing had been messed with, so I stayed. I did what I could to calm myself down. Walked around a bit, cleaned up the area, organized my gear, but I kept feeling like something was off, like I wasn't really alone anymore. That afternoon, I noticed something strange. Across the lake, just on the far edge where the trees came down close to the water, there was a flash of something. Not light, but color, like something moved between the trees, just out of sight. I stared for a long time, but nothing came back. I figured maybe it was a bird or an animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been upright. Human, maybe, but that didn't make sense. I hadn't seen anyone for 2 days. There were no other cars at the trailhead, and this preserve wasn't a place people just stumbled into. It wasn't near any towns or highways. Still, I made a note of it. I didn't cook that night. I ate a cold meal and kept my gear packed, just in case I needed to move fast. I kept the flare gun within arm's reach, even though I didn't know who would even see it if I fired it. I stayed awake as long as I could. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. The same sound: thud, crack, pause. It was closer this time. Too close. Maybe 100 feet, maybe less. It moved around the edge of the camp, but didn't come in. I didn't turn on my light. I just sat there, holding my knife, listening. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. It moved slow, like it was waiting for something. Then it stopped, and didn't move again. I waited for what felt like hours, but I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, I must have passed out from exhaustion. In the morning, I found footprints. Not boots or hiking shoes, but bare feet. Human and big. The toes were wide apart, deep in the soft soil near the lake. Not fresh, but not washed out either. I followed them for a short distance before they vanished into the underbrush. I felt sick. I knew now that I wasn't alone. Someone was out here, barefoot, walking the woods at night, circling my camp. I packed everything. I was done. I didn't even eat. I just crammed my gear into my pack and started hiking back to the trailhead. I kept checking behind me, stopping to listen every few minutes. The forest felt heavier, like the air was thick, like something was pressing down on everything. I didn't hear the sounds again, but I didn't feel safe either. I was sweating even though it was cold. About halfway back, I found something else. Hanging from a tree branch about eye level was a dead squirrel, tied with some kind of plant fiber, its body split open down the middle. Clean, not like an animal kill. Deliberate. I almost threw up. I didn't touch it. I didn't look at it longer than I had to. I just kept moving. The last mile felt like a nightmare. I was running now, full pack bouncing on my back, barely watching the trail. I kept thinking I heard someone behind me, but I didn't stop. I reached my car, slammed everything into it, and drove without even changing out of my boots. I didn't stop until I hit a gas station over an hour away. I sat there for 20 minutes, shaking, drinking water, trying to come down from whatever that was. I didn't call the police. I didn't know what I'd even say. No one had attacked me, nothing had been stolen. There wasn't any real proof. Just sounds, a few footprints, and something strung up in a tree. I told my brother I came back early because I felt sick. That part wasn't a lie. For a long time, I didn't go back into the woods. I stayed in cities. I avoided hikes. Even when I was around trees or parks, I felt watched, like something had... I remember that trip clearly. It wasn't supposed to be anything special, just a weekend at a remote cabin I'd rented alone. A break from the noise and chaos of the city. I wanted to disconnect, breathe fresh air, maybe do some hiking and fishing. The cabin was in the middle of dense woods, about 2 hours' drive from the nearest town. No cell signal, no internet, no one around for miles except maybe a few hunters or weekend campers. It was exactly what I was looking for. I packed my car carefully the night before, tent and sleeping bag just in case, plenty of food and water, matches, a first aid kit, and a good flashlight with extra batteries. I had a map printed out and downloaded an offline GPS app, but the directions to the cabin were vague, mostly unmarked dirt roads. I didn't mind. I've always liked driving through the woods. It feels peaceful in a way the city never can. The drive was quiet, with the sun shining through the tall trees as I passed. I remember the smell of pine and wet earth, the sound of birds, and the occasional distant crack of a twig underfoot. When I arrived, the cabin looked exactly like the pictures on the website. A small, old wooden building with a pitched roof, a porch, and a woodpile stacked beside it. It had electricity and a propane heater, but I decided to use the wood stove inside to save on fuel and enjoy the rustic experience. I unloaded everything and set up inside. The cabin was cozy but simple. A small kitchen area with a stove and sink, a table with 2 chairs, a couch, and a narrow staircase leading to a loft with a bed. The windows had thick curtains, and there were a few shelves filled with books and games. I liked that nothing felt new or fancy. It had been here for a long time, quietly sitting in the woods. The first night passed without incident. I made a fire in the stove, cooked some canned soup, and lay in bed reading until I was too tired to keep my eyes open. Outside, I heard the usual forest sounds: crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the distant rustle of animals moving through the underbrush. It was peaceful. The next day, I decided to explore. I had a small trail map from the cabin owner and set out early, carrying a backpack with water, snacks, and my camera. The woods were thick, the trees tall and close, with patches of moss and wildflowers along the path. The trail twisted and climbed gently, leading to a small stream I wanted to check out. I spent the day walking, snapping photos, and watching for wildlife. I saw deer tracks in the mud and spotted a few rabbits and squirrels. The sun was warm but not hot, and the air smelled fresh and clean. When I returned to the cabin that evening, I made another fire, cooked some pasta, and settled in for the night. That was when things started to feel off. At first, it was small things, sounds that didn't quite fit. A crunch of leaves just outside the window, too sharp and close to be the usual nighttime animals. I'd look outside but see nothing. The fire would sputter as if a sudden draft blew through, but the cabin was sealed tight. I told myself it was just the wind or my imagination. Then I started noticing small signs around the cabin that I hadn't seen before. A broken twig on the porch steps, a small footprint in the mud near the woodpile, something that looked like a scratch on the door frame. None of it was violent or threatening, but it was unusual. I live in the city, so I'm not used to wilderness signs like that. I checked the locks on the doors, made sure the windows were shut. I moved a chair near the front door and planned to keep a heavy flashlight close by at night. Still, I told myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe an animal, maybe a neighbor passing by. The third night, I was lying in the loft bed, listening to the fire crackle below, when I heard it. A slow, deliberate scraping sound coming from outside. It was like nails or claws dragging lightly over wood. I froze, holding my breath, waiting for it to stop. It went on for maybe 20 seconds, then silence. I didn't sleep much that night. In the morning, I went outside to check the porch. There were fresh marks, deep scratches in the wood near the door. They looked like someone had used a knife or maybe a sharp rock to make them. The wood was splintered and gouged. I crouched to look closer and saw small bits of red in the scratches, maybe rust or dried blood. I felt a chill. Still, I refused to panic. Maybe some animal had gotten tangled in something or a careless hunter had stopped by. I cleaned the scratches with water and scrubbed the porch floor, trying to erase the marks. I stayed inside the next day, mostly reading and preparing meals. I tried not to think about the scratches or the noises. I kept the flashlight by my bed and even kept a pocket knife nearby. I told myself I was safe. That evening, I heard footsteps outside, slow, heavy steps that circled the cabin once or twice. The sound was unmistakable, I strained to see through the curtains, but it was too dark. I thought about calling the owner or the local ranger station, but there was no cell signal. The cabin had no landline. The footsteps stopped abruptly outside the back window. Then silence. I waited for hours listening, but nothing else happened. When dawn came, I opened the curtains and went outside cautiously. No footprints, no signs of anyone. The ground was dry and clear. It was like no one had been there. That afternoon, I decided to hike to the ranger station a few miles away to report what had happened and see if anyone could check on the cabin. I packed a small bag with essentials and left a note on the table saying I would return by nightfall. The hike was longer and harder than I expected. The trail was rough and overgrown in places. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling watched, but I didn't see anyone. The forest seemed to close in around me, and the shadows grew long as the sun began to set. When I finally reached the ranger station, I was exhausted. The station was a small building with a few parked trucks and some gear stacked outside. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. I waited, then checked the windows. Inside, the place looked abandoned, dust-covered and dark. I found a note pinned to the door, closed for emergency repairs. Back in 2 days. I felt a growing sense of unease. No one around to help, no signal, no way to call for help if I needed it. I turned back, deciding to make it to the cabin before dark. The hike back was even worse. The light faded quickly, and I had to pull out my flashlight. The woods sounded different at night, closer, sharper. Every crack or rustle set my nerves on edge. I kept thinking about the scratches on the porch, the footsteps circling the cabin. Halfway through the trail, I stopped. There were footprints in the dirt, fresh and big, leading in the direction I was walking. They were too large to be animal prints. My heart pounded. I scanned the trees around me, but there was no one. I quickened my pace, trying to ignore the feeling of being followed. When I got back to the cabin, I found the door open. I don't remember if I screamed or just froze. The door had been locked tight when I left. The key was still in the lock inside. The porch light was off and the fire was cold. Inside, the cabin looked disturbed. Drawers were open. Some of my food was spilled on the floor. The couch cushions had been shifted. I checked every corner. No one was there. I grabbed the pocket knife and went outside, scanning the dark woods around the cabin. The air was cold, and the silence was thick. No footsteps, no voices, nothing. I locked the door again, put the chair back in front, and barricaded it with the heavy woodpile. Then I stayed awake all night, clutching my knife, listening for anything. At dawn, I went outside and saw footprints leading away from the cabin, into the woods. They were human footprints, big and deep in the mud. I followed them as far as I could, but they disappeared after a while in the dense forest. That morning, I packed up everything. I didn't want to stay one more second. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I loaded the car and started the drive back down the dirt road, my eyes constantly flicking to the trees. On the way back, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching me as I passed. They didn't move, just stood there silent and still. I kept driving until I reached the highway, then didn't look back. When I got home, I called the police and reported everything. They told me there were reports of people breaking into cabins in that area, possibly squatters or hunters who got too close. They said they would send patrols to check, but I never went back. I still think about that trip sometimes. The way the quiet turned into something tense and dangerous. The feeling that someone was watching, waiting. The scratches, the footsteps, the open door. No ghosts, no monsters. Just someone or something human hiding in the woods, close enough to reach out and touch the cabin, close enough to make me afraid to stay. That's the kind of scary that stays with you. It was late September when I decided to spend a week alone at a cabin in the woods. The place wasn't fancy, just an old, weathered wooden cabin tucked deep in the forest, far from the nearest town or road. I wanted peace, quiet, and a break from everything. No phones, no internet, no distractions. Just me and the forest. The drive there was long, mostly dirt roads that got narrower and rougher the closer I got. Trees crowded on both sides, their leaves turning shades of orange, red, and yellow. The air was crisp, with that unmistakable smell of pine and earth that only comes with fall. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked smaller than I expected but sturdy enough. The paint was peeling, and the roof had a few loose shingles, but the windows were intact. A thin chimney stuck out from one side, though I wasn't sure if the fireplace still worked. I got out of the car and dragged my bags up to the porch. The wood creaked under my boots, and a few dead leaves skittered across the boards in the wind. The front door opened with a low groan, and inside was dim but cozy. A small kitchen area was on one side with a wood stove, a sink, and a worn table. The living space had a couch covered in old fabric and a couple of chairs. A staircase led upstairs, where I assumed the bedroom was. I spent the first day unpacking and cleaning. The cabin was dusty, and there were cobwebs in the corners, but I liked it. It felt real and alive in a way that hotels or modern cabins didn't. I built a fire in the stove, which took some effort with the damp wood I found outside, but eventually it caught. The warmth filled the room and made it feel homey. The nights were cold. I wrapped myself in a thick blanket and listened to the sounds outside. The wind pushing through the trees, branches tapping the windows, and the distant call of birds settling in for the night. It was peaceful, but there was something else too. An underlying tension that made me alert even when I was alone. The next few days were a mix of hiking, reading, and chopping wood for the stove. I stayed mostly around the cabin, taking short walks along a few trails I found, but I didn't want to get lost. The forest was dense, and the trees seemed to close in behind me, blocking out the sky. On the third day, as the sun was setting, I decided to gather some firewood. The pile outside the cabin was almost gone, and the nights were too cold to risk not having enough wood. I grabbed my axe and a sturdy bag, then walked toward a cluster of fallen trees about 50 yards from the cabin. The woods were quieter than usual. No birds singing, no rustling in the bushes, just a heavy silence. I paused for a moment, feeling a strange chill, but shrugged it off. Maybe it was just the cold creeping in. I found a thick branch that looked dry and easy to split. As I started chopping, I kept my eyes on the shadows around me. The sun was low, and everything looked darker and sharper. Suddenly, I heard a sharp crack, like a branch breaking behind me. I spun around quickly, my heart jumping, but there was nothing there, just trees and leaves. I told myself it was nothing, a deer or some animal moving through the underbrush, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. I finished chopping the wood faster than usual and headed back to the cabin. That night, after dinner, I sat near the stove, staring into the flames. The fire's glow made the room flicker with shadows, and I felt every small noise sharply. The creak of the floorboards, the whistle of wind through cracks in the walls, the tick of the old clock on the shelf. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud banging on the cabin door. My heart raced. I sat up slowly, listening. The banging came again, 3 sharp knocks, then silence. I reached for my phone, but as expected, there was no signal. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and slowly opened the door. Outside was nothing but empty darkness and the trees swaying in the wind. No footprints, no sign of anyone. The banging must have been from a branch or something caught in the wind. I closed the door, locking it firmly, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. The next day was foggy and gray. I stayed inside most of the time, reading and trying to relax, but the image of that knocking haunted me. Around midday, I heard a faint noise outside the window, a scraping sound, like nails or claws against wood. I froze, holding my breath. It stopped suddenly. I got up and looked out. No one. As the day went on, I checked all the doors and windows, making sure they were secure. I felt vulnerable in a way I never had before. The forest that had seemed peaceful now felt hostile, as if something was lurking just out of sight. On the 5th day, things got worse. Early in the morning, I woke to find the firewood pile outside disturbed. Some logs were moved, others broken. I didn't hear anything overnight. The ground was soft from rain, and there were fresh footprints around the pile. They were big, maybe from a man, but I wasn't sure. I knew then that someone had been near the cabin while I slept. I didn't panic immediately. I was alone, and the nearest neighbors were miles away. Calling for help wasn't an option. I decided to be more careful. I locked all the doors and windows, kept my axe close, and stayed alert. That afternoon, while walking along a trail near the cabin, I found more signs: broken branches, trampled bushes, and deep footprints in the mud. They led away from the cabin deeper into the forest. I felt watched, and the hairs on my neck stood up. I turned around and hurried back. That evening, I double-checked the locks and covered the windows with thick blankets to block the view from outside. I made sure my phone was charged, even if there was no signal. Around 11 p.m., I heard footsteps crunching in the gravel outside the cabin. I froze, heart pounding. The steps stopped right at the door, and then I heard the faint sound of breathing, or maybe someone breathing heavily. I grabbed the axe and stayed as quiet as possible, waiting for the sound to move away. Didn't. After what felt like forever, the footsteps retreated, crunching back into the woods. I sat shaking for hours after that, too scared to sleep. The next morning, I packed my bag quickly. I didn't want to be there another minute than I had to. I loaded the car, leaving the cabin door locked but open enough for light to get in. As I drove away down the dirt road, I glanced back once. The trees seemed to close in behind the cabin, hiding whatever had been there. I never went back. That week changed me. I still don't know who was watching me, but I know it wasn't just animals or wind. It was a person, maybe more than one. Someone who knew the woods, who could move silently and stay hidden. The feeling of being hunted in a place where you think you're safe is something I'll never forget. And the lesson is simple. Sometimes the scariest things don't come from myths or ghosts, but from real people and the wild unknown waiting just beyond the door. I spent the better part of a year saving up for a break from everything. A real, honest-to-God escape from the constant noise and stress of the city. When I finally got a chance, I decided to rent a cabin deep in the woods, a place where no one else would be for miles. It wasn't fancy or modern. The cabin was old, built maybe in the 70s. A small wooden box surrounded by thick trees, with a creaky porch and windows that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years. The nearest road was a rough dirt track that disappeared into the forest, and cell service was spotty at best. I packed my gear and drove the long way out, finally pulling off the main highway onto the dirt road just as the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. The forest around me was thick and silent, the kind of silence that's heavier than any noise. My car bounced over roots and rocks until I reached the cabin, and as I stepped out, the air smelled like wet earth and pine needles. It was the kind of smell that feels old, like the forest had been there for hundreds of years and wasn't going anywhere. The cabin door protested with a loud creak when I opened it. Inside, the place was dark, lit only by the fading sunlight coming through the grimy windows. Dust hung in the air, thick enough to see in the light beams. The floorboards were worn, and the walls showed signs of water damage near the ceiling. There was a small fireplace with some old ashes inside, a rickety table, and 2 folding chairs. I dropped my backpack on the floor and took a slow breath, letting the quiet wash over me. The plan was simple. I'd stay here alone for 5 days. No phone, no internet, just me and the woods. I brought a stack of books, some food, water, a lantern, and enough firewood to keep warm. At first, everything felt peaceful in that old cabin. I chopped wood, cleaned the place up a bit, and started a fire in the hearth. The crackle of burning wood was the only sound besides the occasional creak of the cabin settling or the soft rustle of leaves outside. Night came fast, wrapping the cabin in thick darkness. With no streetlights or city glow, the stars were brilliant, scattered like tiny pinpricks in a deep black blanket. The first night was surprisingly calm. I fell asleep to the smell of burning pine and the distant call of an owl. I woke early the next day, sunlight filtering through the windows. After a quick breakfast, I pulled on my boots and decided to explore the area around the cabin. The forest was dense, with tall pines and thick underbrush. I followed a narrow animal trail for a while, stepping carefully over roots and rocks. There was a small creek nearby, water clear and cold, running over smooth stones. I refilled my water bottle there, then sat on a fallen log to rest. While walking back, I noticed something odd on the ground. A set of footprints pressed into the soft dirt. They weren't human, but they were large, about the size of a big dog's paw, and deep. I followed the prints cautiously, keeping an eye on my surroundings. The trail led deeper into the woods, curving around trees and disappearing behind a thick patch of ferns. I stopped, realizing I didn't want to wander too far from the cabin, especially alone. Back at the cabin, I felt a strange unease settle over me. It was subtle, like a shadow just at the edge of my awareness. I tried to shake it off, blaming the isolation and the unfamiliar noises of the forest. As the afternoon wore on, the sun dipped lower, and the shadows in the trees grew longer and darker. I gathered more firewood and stacked it near the door. That night, the forest felt different. The usual sounds, the rustle of animals, the occasional bird call, were gone or replaced by something quieter but more tense. The wind whispered through the pines, but it wasn't the friendly rustling I'd heard before. It was sharper, almost like it was carrying a warning. Around midnight, I woke up to a soft thumping sound outside. My heart jumped. The cabin floor creaked under my steps as I got up and grabbed my flashlight. I moved to the window and shone the light into the darkness. Nothing moved, but the beam caught the edge of the porch where the shadows seemed thicker. I saw nothing but the dark trees swaying in the wind. The noise stopped, but I didn't sleep well after that. I kept hearing little sounds, something brushing against the cabin, a low crack as a branch broke nearby, even a faint scraping noise on the wood of the porch. I told myself it was just the forest settling, that animals were moving around, nothing more. The next day, I woke exhausted but determined to push past the fear creeping into my mind. I decided to explore a little more, this time sticking to the area directly around the cabin. As I walked, I noticed more signs. Broken branches at unusual heights, patches of disturbed dirt, and more large footprints like the ones I'd seen the day before. I realized these prints weren't from any animal I knew. They were too big, and their shape was strange, wide, with claws but almost human in their length. That thought unsettled me, but I tried not to dwell on it. I told myself the prints could belong to a bear or a large dog, and that was that. Still, I stayed alert, keeping an eye on the thick trees and underbrush. Late that afternoon, I heard something move in the woods. It was quick, a heavy thud followed by a rustle of leaves. I froze, waiting to see if I could spot whatever it was. Nothing came into view, but the sense of being watched grew stronger. I hurried back to the cabin, the weight of the forest pressing in around me. Inside, I checked all the windows and doors, making sure they were locked. The cabin felt smaller somehow, like the walls were closing in. I spent the evening reading by the fire, trying to focus on the words and block out the dark outside. That night, the noises returned, louder and closer. There was scratching on the cabin walls, slow and deliberate, like claws dragging along the wood. The porch floor creaked as if something heavy was pacing back and forth. I sat frozen, heart pounding, listening as the noises continued for what felt like hours. At one point, the scratching moved beneath the window. I stared out into the blackness, flashlight ready but afraid to shine it directly. The silence after the noises stopped was worse than the sounds themselves. I lay awake, every muscle tense, waiting for dawn. When morning came, pale light breaking through the dirty windows, I felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. I checked outside carefully. The porch was covered in deep scratches, gouges in the wood where something had clawed at it hard. Nearby, the large footprints circled the cabin, some pressed into the soft dirt right up to the door. I spent the day preparing to leave early. I packed up as quickly as I could, moving in a blur of tension and adrenaline. I made sure my gear was ready and loaded it all into the car. Before getting in, I scanned the trees one last time, feeling eyes on me from the shadows. The drive back was tense, every rustle of leaves or flicker in the woods setting my nerves on edge. When I finally reached the highway and saw other cars, I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Looking back, the experience wasn't about ghosts or legends. It was about the very real and dangerous presence of something wild, something unknown, lurking just beyond the edge of the cabin. The woods were alive with it, a predator that stalked the night and watched with intent. I didn't stay to find out what it was. The scratches, the prints, and the sounds made it clear this wasn't a place for me. The forest took back its silence as I drove away, and I never went back to that cabin. But even now, months later, the memory lingers. The cold fear, the weight of unseen eyes, and the unmistakable feeling that something very real was waiting just outside the door. I never planned to spend a night in that cabin. It was one of those trips I thought would be easy, just a quick break from city life, a few days out in the woods to clear my head. I had been working too hard, feeling trapped by deadlines and noise and people. The idea of waking up to birds instead of alarms, of drinking coffee by a fire instead of a crowded cafe, it sounded like a dream. I didn't know then how badly that trip would change me. The cabin sat deep in a forest that wasn't very far from the main road, but still felt like its own world. I'd rented it online, a small wooden structure with no internet, no phone reception, and only the basics inside. A stove, a small fridge, some dishes, and a bed. It was simple but cozy, exactly what I thought I needed. The pictures showed warm sunlight pouring through big windows and a porch overlooking tall pine trees. I was ready to be alone. When I arrived late afternoon, the sun was already dipping low. The forest was thick, the air sharp with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. I parked my car on the gravel driveway and grabbed my bag, the only sound being the crunch of my boots on the gravel. The air felt clean, almost cold, even though it was late summer. I unlocked the cabin door, stepped inside, and the silence wrapped around me like a blanket. The cabin smelled of wood and old smoke. The floor creaked softly beneath my feet. The windows were open, letting in a soft breeze that fluttered the thin curtains. I set my bag down, walked to the porch and looked out over the forest. The trees stretched in every direction, the sky a fading blue with streaks of orange. There was no one else around. No sounds of cars, no voices, just the faint rustle of leaves. I unpacked my small cooler, took out some food, and lit the stove to boil water for tea. The cabin was basic, but it had enough to feel comfortable. I sat on the wooden chair by the window and watched as the sun disappeared behind the trees. Night was coming fast. The forest around me darkened and shifted from warm golds to deep shadows. I wasn't worried. I'd camped before, stayed in cabins before, but something about that place felt different. As night fell, the forest came alive with noises I didn't expect. Owls called somewhere far off, insects buzzed loudly, and every now and then a sharp crack of a twig echoed nearby. I wasn't scared. I was curious. I opened the door and stepped onto the porch, the cool air brushing my face. The sky was clear, stars twinkling far away, bright and sharp. I went inside and read a book by the small lamp on the table. The cabin felt safe. The walls were thick and sturdy, but as I settled in, I noticed the silence was different than any silence I had known in the city. It was heavier, almost like something was waiting in the shadows outside. I tried to push the feeling away. Around midnight, I heard the noise for the first time. A slow, steady sound coming from outside. Not loud, but steady, like footsteps crunching leaves or twigs breaking. I stopped reading and held my breath, listening. It stopped. I waited a moment, then it started again, a little farther away this time. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon. The forest was full of life. I closed the door, locked it, and tried to fall asleep, but the sounds didn't stop. Every so often, the same crunching noise returned, coming closer, then moving away. I sat up and looked through the window, but the night was too dark. The trees were black shapes against the sky. I wanted to convince myself it was nothing. In the morning, sunlight spilled through the windows and made the cabin feel warmer. I was tired, but I thought a day of hiking would clear my head. I put on my boots, packed a small backpack with water, snacks, and a map, and stepped out. The forest in daylight was peaceful, almost beautiful. The trees swayed gently, and birds flitted from branch to branch. I followed a trail that led away from the cabin deeper into the woods. The path was narrow and overgrown in places. I passed broken branches and signs of animals. Tracks in the dirt, gnawed leaves, a disturbed patch of earth. The air smelled fresh. I felt a bit better, though the strange noises from last night lingered in my mind. After a few hours of walking, I returned to the cabin as the sun dipped low again. I cooked dinner over the stove, the smell of sautéed vegetables filling the small space. I settled down to rest, trying to shake off the tension building in my chest. That night, the noises came back louder. Footsteps, crunches, something dragging maybe across the ground. I didn't open the door this time. I sat in the dark, listening, my heart pounding. The sounds moved around the cabin, circling it slowly. Then, suddenly, a sharp thud hit the side of the cabin. Wood knocked against wood hard and fast. I grabbed a flashlight and switched it on, shining the beam outside. The porch was empty. No footprints, no sign of anything. The forest looked dark and still, but the feeling of being watched was intense. I moved closer to the door, checking the locks again. The noise was gone, but my hands shook. Over the next day, I explored the area more carefully. I checked the perimeter around the cabin and found strange marks on the ground near the back porch. The dirt was disturbed, dragged in a straight line. Something big, heavier than an animal. I thought about telling someone, but I was alone and out of phone range. I couldn't leave yet. I'd planned to stay 2 more days. That night was the worst. The noises started early, footsteps circling the cabin, then the sound of heavy breathing just outside the window. I turned on all the lights inside, sat near the door with the flashlight ready. The breathing stopped when I pointed the beam outside, but I saw nothing. Then came the banging. Not a tap or a knock, but hard hits on the cabin walls like someone trying to get in. I was frozen, scared but unable to move. The banging lasted for what felt like an hour. When it finally stopped, the forest fell silent again. I stayed awake all night, my ears straining for any sound. Dawn finally came, pale and gray, and I felt exhausted, drained. I thought about packing up and leaving. Maybe this was no place for me. I checked outside in the morning. The ground around the cabin was torn up, like something had been digging or scraping the earth. The marks weren't animal prints. They were deeper, wider, something big, strong. The thought made my stomach churn. I found broken branches on the path, some snapped at odd angles, like someone had pushed through the bushes roughly. I kept thinking maybe it was a wild animal, but the noises didn't fit. Animals don't make breathing sounds like that, or bang on walls like they want to get in. As the second night fell, I was ready to leave first thing in the morning. I ate a quick meal, packed most of my things by flashlight, and waited for darkness to come. Then, as the sky turned black, the noises started again. Footsteps, breathing, banging. But this time, something was different. The footsteps were heavier, slower, and closer. I could hear scratching on the door, nails or claws dragging across the wood. I gripped my flashlight tightly, my heart pounding so loud it felt like it would burst through my chest. The banging grew louder, more urgent. Suddenly, the door handle rattled violently, and the door shook. I ran to the window and shone the light outside. Just shadows, tall and moving quickly away into the trees. No figure stayed long enough to be seen clearly. I didn't sleep. I sat in a corner with my bag packed, ready to run. Before dawn, I heard the footsteps again, but this time coming from the other side of the cabin. I crept quietly, careful not to make a sound. I looked through the window and saw something I will never forget. A man, dirty, with ragged clothes, dragging a large branch behind him. His face was shadowed, but his eyes caught the faint moonlight, wild and desperate. He stopped, looked directly at the cabin, then vanished into the trees. I didn't wait any longer. I opened the door quietly and slipped out into the cold morning. The forest was quiet again, but my heart was racing. I ran to my car, threw my bag in the back seat, and locked the doors. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin disappearing in the rearview mirror, hidden among the trees. I never wanted to come back there. Later, I reported what happened to the local ranger station. They told me the area was known for transient people passing through, drifters, people hiding from something or someone. Sometimes they stayed near cabins or campsites. Most were harmless, but some could be dangerous if caught off guard. I realized then the noises, the banging, the breathing, it wasn't anything supernatural or strange. It was someone scared, someone desperate trying to find shelter or maybe escape. But alone, unprepared, it was terrifying. The man might have been homeless or running from something worse. I never saw him again, but I can't forget the feeling of being hunted. I had been looking forward to the cabin trip for months. Work had been brutal lately, with back-to-back deadlines and little rest. I needed a break, a way to get away from the noise of the city, the hum of screens, and the endless chatter of people. So when I found a small cabin rental deep in the woods, far off the grid, I booked it without hesitation. The photos showed a simple wooden cabin surrounded by tall pines and nothing else for miles. No electricity, no internet, just peace. I planned to spend a full week there alone, with only my books, some basic supplies, and my thoughts. The drive out was longer than I expected. The last 20 miles were on a narrow dirt road that twisted and turned through the forest. I drove slowly, careful not to get stuck in the soft earth or hit a fallen branch. The trees closed in overhead, blocking out most of the sun. The silence around me felt heavy but calming. It was like entering another world. The air smelled fresh and earthy, with hints of pine and moss. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin was small, maybe 400 square feet, made of rough, untreated logs with a pitched roof covered in old shingles. There was a small porch with a couple of wooden chairs and a rusty metal bucket for firewood. A stack of chopped logs sat neatly by the side, ready for the fire pit just a few feet away. The windows were dusty but intact. It looked untouched, maybe abandoned for a while, but still solid. I got out of the car, stretched, and took a deep breath. The quiet was almost overwhelming. No cars, no airplanes, no dogs barking. Just the wind in the trees and the occasional bird call. I unlocked the door with the key the owner had sent me ahead of time and stepped inside. The inside smelled of old wood, cold air, and a faint trace of mildew. The floor was rough planks, worn from time. There was a small kitchen area with a rusty stove, a sink with no running water, and a single cupboard. A wooden table and 2 chairs sat near a window, which looked out onto the dense forest. The main room had a small couch covered in a faded plaid blanket, a couple of shelves with some dusty books and cans of food, and a wood stove in the corner. A narrow door led to a tiny bedroom with a simple bed and a cracked mattress. No electricity meant I had to rely on flashlights, candles, and the fire pit. I unpacked my things carefully, setting my backpack on the floor. I had brought enough canned food, bottled water, a lantern, matches, and warm clothes. I also had a first aid kit and a hunting knife I always carried for emergencies. After setting everything up, I went outside to gather some wood for a fire. The sun was just about to disappear behind the trees. I stacked logs in the fire pit, arranging dry branches and twigs underneath. I struck a match and lit them carefully, watching the flames catch and grow. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks into the cool evening air. The light flickered on the trees around me, making the shadows dance. I sat back in one of the chairs and let myself relax for the first time in weeks. Night fell fast in the forest. The temperature dropped sharply. The stars appeared one by one in the clear sky, shining brighter than I'd seen in years. The only sounds were the fire's crackle, the rustle of the wind through the branches, and the distant hoot of an owl. I felt peaceful but also very small, surrounded by the vast, dark woods. After dinner, a simple can of soup heated on the stove. I cleaned up and got ready for bed. The cabin was cold. I stacked more wood into the stove and lit it, but the heat barely spread beyond the corner where the stove sat. I wrapped myself in the blanket on the bed and lay down, listening to the sounds outside. That's when I first noticed it. A faint noise coming from outside. At first, it was just a soft rustling, like branches brushing against each other. I thought it was the wind, but then it sounded closer, like something moving through the underbrush. I stayed still, straining my ears. The noise came in bursts, quick and deliberate, not random like the wind. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make me tense. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. The forest was full of wildlife. But as the minutes passed, the noise seemed to come closer, circling the cabin. I didn't want to get up, so I stayed under the blanket, trying to steady my breathing. Suddenly, there was a louder snap, like a thick branch breaking just beyond the clearing. I froze. The fire's light flickered as the wind shifted. I grabbed my flashlight from the bedside table and clicked it on, shining it toward the window. The beam cut through the darkness but didn't reveal anything. No movement, no eyes reflecting back. I turned off the light and tried to calm myself down. I wasn't alone out here. People lived or hunted in these woods. Maybe a hunter had wandered too close or a camper was nearby. I told myself to get some rest and face it in the morning. The next day, I stayed busy chopping more wood, exploring the small area around the cabin, and reading. The sun was bright, and the forest looked peaceful. I didn't hear any noises that day, just birds and the occasional squirrel scampering through the leaves. But as night came again, the strange noises returned. It started earlier, just after sunset, when I was cooking dinner. The rustling began outside the window. This time, I saw something move past the tree line. Something big and dark, too large to be a deer. I grabbed my knife and flashlight again, heart pounding. I went to the porch and shone the light into the woods, but it was too dense to see far. The figure was gone. I locked the door behind me and checked all the windows. Nothing was broken or disturbed. Still, I didn't feel safe. I spent a restless night. Every crack and snap made me jump. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps circling the cabin. I wanted to believe it was an animal, but the steps sounded too heavy, too slow and deliberate, like someone was watching me. The next morning, I found marks on the porch steps, deep scratches gouged into the wood, as if something had tried to climb up or claw its way inside. I took pictures with my phone, my hands shaking. Whoever or whatever was out there was getting bolder. I decided to stay inside as much as possible during the day, gathering firewood only when necessary. I kept my knife close and my phone charged with the car battery. On the third night, the noises were worse. The rustling was constant, almost like whispering, except no words could be heard. I swear I saw shapes moving just beyond the tree line, watching, waiting. That night, I barely slept. I sat by the fire pit, a baseball bat in hand, eyes scanning the darkness. Then I heard it. Footsteps approaching the cabin from the side, careful but steady. I froze, listening as they stopped right outside the door. My heart thumped in my chest. I waited, expecting someone to knock or call out, but nothing happened, just silence. Then, slowly, the door handle rattled. I swung the bat hard against the door, making a loud bang. The footsteps ran off into the forest. The next morning, I found deep marks on the door handle, as if someone had tried to force it open. My stomach twisted. I called the cabin owner and told them everything. They said no one was supposed to be near the property and that they'd check with the local ranger station. But I didn't wait for them. I started packing immediately. The forest that day felt different, heavier somehow. The shadows were darker, the air colder. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone watching me. I locked the cabin tight and drove down the dirt road as fast as I dared, never once stopping until I reached the main highway. I didn't look back. The strangest part was, after I left, I never found out who or what had been there. No evidence, no reports of trespassers or criminals nearby. The ranger said the area was remote and quiet. No recent visitors except a few hikers. But I knew what I heard, what I saw. Someone had been watching me, trying to get inside. Since that trip, I never go back to the cabin or any place so isolated. The experience changed me. It wasn't ghosts or monsters. It was real people with unknown intentions, hiding in the woods, waiting. That kind of fear is more terrifying than any ghost story. I want to tell you about a trip I took to a cabin deep in the woods. One of the scariest experiences I've ever had. It's not about ghosts or monsters, but about something far more real and unsettling. I've never told this story fully before, but I'll lay it all out here, every detail I remember, so you can understand why I never went back there. A few years ago, I was craving some time alone, away from the noise of the city, from people and their endless chatter, deadlines, and flashing screens. I found a cabin for rent through a website, located in a forested area about 4 hours from the nearest town. It was nothing fancy, just a small wooden cabin with one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a wood stove. The place was remote, no cell service, no internet, no one for miles around. Perfect, I thought, a place to disconnect and be quiet with my own thoughts. I arrived late afternoon. The sun was already low but still bright enough to see the tall pine trees stretching up all around. The air was cool and smelled like wet earth and pine needles. The gravel driveway ended at the cabin's porch, which creaked softly under my boots as I stepped onto it. The cabin looked exactly as it did in the pictures. Weathered logs, a crooked chimney, windows streaked with dirt, and a heavy wooden door with a rusted latch. Inside, the air was cold and smelled faintly of old wood and dust. The floorboards groaned when I walked. There was a small kitchen with a sink, an old gas stove, and a cupboard stocked with some basic supplies. Canned beans, rice, coffee, and a few spices. The bedroom was tiny, just a bed with an old quilt and a nightstand with a kerosene lamp. The bathroom was a basic outhouse a short walk outside. I unpacked slowly, trying to shake the tiredness from the drive. I had packed light. A few changes of clothes, a book, a flashlight, matches, and some food. The plan was simple. Spend 3 days there, no distractions, just the forest and me. As the sun sank lower, I started a fire in the wood stove. It took some effort to get it going. The wood was damp, but eventually the room warmed and the flickering light chased away the shadows. I made a cup of coffee and settled into the small armchair by the window to watch the last light fade behind the trees. That first evening was peaceful. I listened to the sounds outside, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of a bird, the snap of a twig somewhere in the woods. Felt good to be alone like that. I went to bed early, tired from the drive and the day's work. The bed was creaky and the quilt scratchy, but I was too tired to care. I had the flashlight on the nightstand just in case. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. There was a sound outside, faint but distinct. A scraping noise, like something being dragged over rough ground. I lay very still, heart pounding, listening. The sound stopped after a minute, replaced by silence. I told myself it was probably a deer or some small animal, and after a while, I fell back asleep. The next morning, I woke to gray skies and a fine drizzle of rain tapping on the roof. I stayed inside mostly, lighting the stove and making tea, reading my book. I decided to explore the small area around the cabin once the rain stopped. In the afternoon, the rain eased, and I grabbed my rain jacket to walk a little. The forest was thick with tall pine trees, the ground soft with moss and fallen needles. The air smelled fresh and wet. I wandered a few hundred meters, following a narrow path that led downhill toward a small creek. The water was clear and cold, rushing over smooth stones. I crouched by the edge, watching a few leaves float downstream. As I stood up, I noticed something odd on the ground near the path. A small patch of disturbed earth. It looked like something heavy had been dragged across the soft soil, leaving long scratches in the dirt. The marks weren't fresh, but not old either, maybe a day or two old. I looked around carefully but saw no signs of animals or anything else that might have made the marks. The feeling of being watched crept over me, an uneasy chill that had nothing to do with the cool, damp air. I didn't want to think too much about it and hurried back to the cabin. I locked the door behind me and double-checked the windows. That night, the scraping noise came again, louder this time, closer to the cabin. It was slow and deliberate, like something dragging wood or metal across the ground. I stayed awake, listening, gripping the flashlight tightly. The sound stopped after about 10 minutes, and after a long time, I finally fell asleep. The next day, I found more strange signs. The path leading from the cabin was scratched up in multiple places. Small piles of broken branches were stacked neatly near the edge of the trees. I remembered the stories about hunters marking territory or animals marking spots, but this felt different, more intentional and organized. That afternoon, I noticed the kerosene lamp on the nightstand was tipped over. I was certain I had left it upright the night before. I chalked it up to me forgetting or it getting knocked by the creaky floor, but the small pile of dirt and pine needles near the base of the lamp caught my eye. It looked like it had been brushed there on purpose. I started feeling more and more uncomfortable. The cabin didn't feel like a safe refuge anymore, but a trap. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination fueled by being alone in the woods. The sun was setting early now, and the sky was heavy with dark clouds. As I sat near the stove, I heard a sudden crash outside, as if something heavy had hit the side of the cabin. My heart jumped, and I grabbed the flashlight, ready to check. The rain was starting again, and I hesitated but knew I had to see what was out there. I stepped outside, the ground muddy underfoot. The flashlight's beam swept over the forest edge. There were broken branches lying in a trail leading away from the cabin into the thick woods. I followed it carefully, the beam flickering over wet leaves and tree trunks. The trail ended about 30 meters from the cabin at a large fallen tree, and there, lying partially covered by leaves, was a rusted metal box. It looked old, battered, and heavy. I knelt down to examine it, heart pounding, unsure if I should open it. The box was locked with a rusty latch but didn't look strong. I pulled the latch open with some effort. Inside was a collection of items: empty food cans, a half-used roll of duct tape, some old batteries, a pocket knife with a dull blade, and a few small tools. Everything looked worn and used. It was clear someone had been here recently, maybe living rough in the woods. That realization made my skin crawl. I wasn't alone here. Someone had been close to the cabin, watching me. I took the box back to the cabin, locking the door behind me. My mind raced, wondering who this person was and what they wanted. I kept the box near me all night, the scratching noises growing louder and more frequent outside. By the third day, I was exhausted, nervous, and eager to leave. I packed my things quickly, but as I was loading the car, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, flashlight in hand, shining it into the trees. No one, but the footprints were there, fresh, leading from the edge of the woods toward the cabin. They were large boots, not animal prints. I jumped into the car and locked the doors. The engine roared to life, and I drove away as fast as I could, not looking back. It wasn't until I got home and rested that I understood the full danger I had been in. I reported the strange activity to the local ranger station, describing the signs and the box. They told me there had been reports of a man living illegally in the woods, sometimes hunting without permission, sometimes threatening people. He was known to be violent and unstable. I had narrowly escaped running into him. I've never been back to the cabin or that area. The experience still haunts me, not because of ghosts or legends, but because I came face to face with the reality of being truly alone in the wilderness, and the very real danger of running into someone who shouldn't be there. It was the kind of plan I made on a whim, the kind where you don't think much, you just decide and go. I needed to get away from the city, from the noise and constant buzz of life that never seemed to pause. I wanted silence, something raw and quiet, a place where I could clear my head and feel some peace. That's why I chose to spend a weekend alone in a small cabin tucked deep inside the woods, far from any real civilization. I packed my things the night before and drove a long way to reach the place. The road was narrow and winding, and the deeper I went, the fewer cars I saw. The last stretch was a dirt road, bumpy and uneven, surrounded by tall pines on either side. When I finally pulled up, the cabin was exactly how I imagined. Small, made of rough timber, with a stone chimney, and windows thick with dust and age. It wasn't fancy. It was simple and quiet and perfect for what I needed. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and cold air, with just a hint of mustiness from sitting empty most of the year. I dropped my bag and opened the windows to let fresh air in. The sun was dipping low, casting a warm orange glow that lit up the rough walls. I built a fire in the stone fireplace, stacked some logs, and got it going. The crackle and warmth of the fire were comforting, like the first step to settling in. I sat on the floor next to it, feeling the heat on my face, listening to the sudden silence outside. No cars, no people, just the sound of the wind moving through the trees and the occasional bird calling somewhere far away. That night, I slept in the single bed the cabin had, covered by a thick wool blanket that smelled faintly like smoke. The walls were thin, and I could hear the small noises of the forest outside. Branches scraping, small animals rustling through leaves, the distant call of an owl. Felt strange, but not scary yet. It was just nature doing its thing. The next day, I woke up early, eager to explore. I had a small map of the area, marked with hiking trails and a lake nearby. I packed a simple backpack with water, some snacks, and my phone, though I knew there was no service here. The air was crisp and cold, but clean, and the sky was bright blue with just a few clouds. I set off down one of the trails, walking through thick woods that were so dense the sunlight barely reached the ground. The forest was alive in a way cities never are. I noticed little things. The way the moss grew thick on tree trunks, the patterns of mushrooms pushing through fallen leaves, the tracks of animals in the soft dirt. I walked for hours, following the trail until I reached the lake. It was small, surrounded by more trees, the water clear and still. I sat down on a rock by the edge and ate some food, feeling completely alone and peaceful. On the way back, the sun started to lower again, and the shadows grew longer. I felt a little tired but didn't rush. I wanted to enjoy the quiet and the slow walk. But as I got closer to the cabin, something felt off. The forest seemed darker, denser somehow, and the silence was heavier. The normal sounds of the woods, birds chirping, the rustle of small animals, had almost stopped. It was like the forest was holding its breath. When I reached the cabin, I noticed the front door was slightly open. I was sure I had closed it tight that morning. My heart started beating faster, a little alarm going off in my mind. I closed the door behind me and checked the locks. Everything inside looked normal, no signs of anyone having been there. No footprints or broken branches outside. Nothing unusual in the small living area. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it might have just been the wind. I made some coffee on the small stove and sat by the fire again. The warmth felt good, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, like something was out there just beyond the trees, waiting. I told myself I was imagining things, but my skin crawled anyway. Later that night, I lay in bed listening to the noises outside. Suddenly, there was a loud snap, like a branch breaking close by. My heart jumped. Then I heard it again, and again, slow, heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush near the cabin. I froze, trying not to breathe too loud. The footsteps stopped right outside, just beyond the window. I could hear the faint scrape of gravel against wood. I wanted to get up and look, but something stopped me, a deep instinct to stay quiet and still. After a while, the footsteps moved away slowly, fading back into the forest. I waited for what felt like hours before I finally felt safe enough to fall asleep. The next morning, I checked outside and found deep footprints in the soft earth near the cabin, big, heavy, not like any animal tracks I'd seen before. They led around the cabin and disappeared into the woods. My mind raced, trying to figure out what it could have been. Maybe a bear or some large animal, but it didn't seem right. The prints were too straight and too close to the cabin for a wild animal that didn't want to be noticed. That day, I decided to pack up and leave. I wanted to stay safe and not push my luck. But as I gathered my things, I noticed something strange. My backpack, the one I left outside on the porch bench, was moved. The zipper was slightly open, and some of my things were scattered on the ground. My heart pounded hard in my chest. I hadn't seen anyone, but someone, or something, had been close to me, messing with my stuff. I grabbed everything quickly and locked the cabin door behind me. I didn't stop walking until I was back at my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. When I finally got inside and locked the doors, I sat for a long time, breathing hard, trying to calm down. The drive back was tense. Every noise, every shadow outside the windows made me jump. I kept checking my rearview mirror, expecting to see headlights or a figure following me, but there was nothing. The forest slowly gave way to open fields, then to highway lights, and finally to the city. Back home, I tried to think about what happened. Was it a person? Someone watching the cabin? Maybe a hunter or someone who lives rough in the woods? Or was it an animal? A bear or something else? I didn't want to tell anyone because it felt embarrassing, like I was overreacting, but the fear stayed with me. In the days after, I kept checking the news and local reports. There were stories about people getting robbed or followed near the woods, but nothing that matched exactly what I experienced. I also thought about going back, but I knew I couldn't. The peace I wanted turned into something else, a fear I couldn't ignore. Now, every time I see the woods or hear about cabins in the wild, I remember that weekend. It wasn't ghosts or anything supernatural. It was something very real and very human, or maybe wild. And sometimes that's even scarier. The first time I ever stayed at the cabin, I thought it would be a quiet escape from everything. I wanted nothing more than to get away from the noise of the city, the constant buzz of people, and the endless distractions that never seemed to let me breathe. I found a small, secluded cabin in the woods online, a place with no electricity, no internet, no phone signal, just nature and silence. It was deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by thick trees and nothing but dirt roads leading up to it. Perfect. I packed my bags carefully. I made sure to bring plenty of supplies, food that didn't need refrigeration, water, a first aid kit, a strong flashlight with extra batteries, a gas stove, a big pot, and a good axe. I also had a map, an old paper one, because I wasn't going to rely on my phone out there. The plan was simple. Get there on Friday afternoon, spend the weekend alone, and come back Monday morning feeling refreshed. Nothing complicated. The drive to the cabin was long but peaceful. The last 10 miles or so were on a rough dirt road with potholes and sharp turns. The trees pressed close to the sides of the road, their branches swaying in the wind, casting shadows that danced as my headlights passed over them. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, the sun was low, casting a warm golden light over everything. The cabin itself was small. Rough wooden planks, a stone chimney, and a porch just wide enough for a couple of chairs. It looked exactly like in the pictures, maybe even better. I spent the first hour just walking around the area, taking it all in. The forest was dense, and the air smelled of pine and damp earth. There was a small creek nearby, the water clear and cool. Birds chirped here and there, and I could hear the faint rustling of small animals in the underbrush. The kind of place you'd expect to find deer or maybe a fox. No one else was around. No cars, no sounds of civilization, just the forest. That night, I lit a fire in the small fire pit outside the cabin. The crackling flames threw a soft orange glow across the yard and the side of the cabin. The stars were bright, scattered across the sky like tiny diamonds. I cooked some canned beans and rice on the gas stove, ate slowly, and then sat back watching the fire until it burned low. The silence was deep and total. I liked it. After I went inside, I locked the wooden door, pulled the heavy curtains over the windows, and got ready for bed. The cabin was cold, colder than I expected, but I had plenty of blankets, and I wrapped myself up tight. The floor creaked under my feet, and the wind outside made the windows rattle a little, but it was peaceful. I felt safe. Around 3 a.m., something woke me up. I wasn't sure what at first. It was a sound, not loud, but clear enough to pull me out of sleep. A scratching, maybe like nails or claws dragging along wood. At first, I thought it was an animal like a raccoon or a stray dog, but then it repeated closer this time. A scraping noise on the side of the cabin. I froze. The cabin was still dark except for the thin beam of moonlight through the window. My heart beat faster. I grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table, switched it on, and shone it toward the window. Outside, the shadows stretched and moved with the wind. Nothing was there. I tried to convince myself it was just a branch brushing against the cabin, but the noise came again, more distinct this time, like something was scraping or clawing on the wooden wall. I crept to the window and looked outside. The porch was empty, the yard was quiet, and the trees swayed gently. Still, the sound came again, this time from the back of the cabin. I didn't want to go outside, but I grabbed my jacket and stepped out onto the porch, flashlight in hand. The cold night air hit me hard. I circled the cabin slowly, shining the light over the ground and up into the trees. There were footprints in the soft dirt near the back door. Big ones, too big to be a deer or any small animal. The prints were deep, like someone heavy had stepped there. But the strange part was that they started about 15 feet away from the door and ended just before the door frame, like someone had stopped there and then vanished. I stood still, heart pounding in my chest. My breath came out in quick, misty puffs. The forest was silent, the night deep and dark. I felt completely alone and yet somehow watched. I locked the door tighter and double-checked all the windows. The scratching noise didn't come again after that, but the footprints stayed with me in my mind. The next day, I tried to distract myself with hiking and exploring the area. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, full of life and color. I followed the creek for a while, found a small waterfall, and took pictures on my phone. I picked wild berries carefully and ate some for a snack. I even collected firewood to keep the fire going at night. That evening, after the sun set and the sky darkened, I sat by the fire again, staring into the flames. The silence felt heavy now, like it was pressing down on me. I thought about the footprints and the scraping sound. I told myself it was probably just an animal, or maybe another camper passing by without leaving a trace. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the wind brushing through the trees, made me jump. I kept the flashlight within arm's reach and my axe leaned up against the bedpost. Around midnight, I heard it again, the scraping sound, closer this time, right outside the cabin walls. I stayed perfectly still, holding my breath. The noise went on for maybe a minute, slow and deliberate, like something was testing the wood. Then, a loud thump hit the side of the cabin, as if someone had slammed their fist against the wall. My heart nearly exploded. I grabbed the axe and slowly crept toward the door, shining the flashlight through the window. Outside, I could see footprints again, fresh and deep in the dirt, circling the cabin like someone had been walking around, watching. But this time, the footprints were uneven, as if the person had been limping or dragging something. I didn't stay outside to investigate more. I locked the door, backed away, and stayed as quiet as I could, clutching the axe close. The next morning, I knew I had to leave. Something about the place had shifted. It was no longer just peaceful woods. It was a trap. I packed quickly, double-checked my supplies, and headed out on the dirt road. But the moment I drove away, I realized my phone still had no signal, no bars at all. I kept driving toward the nearest town, but after 20 minutes, the dirt road ended at a fork. One way led deeper into the woods, the other toward what the map showed as a small highway. I took the highway route, hoping it would get me back to civilization. That's when I noticed something odd. In the rearview mirror, for miles, I could see a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. Didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, as still as a statue, every few miles I passed. Sometimes the figure disappeared behind a tree, only to reappear again a bit further down the road. My heart raced, but I didn't stop. I kept driving until the road merged onto a paved highway and finally, the town came into view. Only then did I breathe a little easier. Later, I learned from the locals that the area around the cabin was known for being isolated, yes, but there were rumors of people, homeless or drifters, who sometimes lived in the woods, hunting for food, staying hidden from the world. The footprints I saw, the figure I kept glimpsing, probably one of those people. It explained the limping, the silent watching, the feeling of being stalked. I never went back to that cabin. The experience stayed with me for a long time. It was a reminder that sometimes, The scariest things are not ghosts or monsters, but real people living in the shadows, and the isolation that once felt like a refuge can quickly become a trap. I've told myself over and over that I was lucky to get out when I did. I didn't hear footsteps inside the cabin, and no one ever tried to break in while I was there. But knowing that someone was close enough to leave those marks, close enough to watch me in the dark, made all the difference. The forest wasn't just quiet, it was waiting. That weekend taught me to respect the wilderness in a new way. Not just the trees or the animals, but the people who might be living on the edge of it, hidden from sight. Next time, I'll bring a buddy, a phone with a signal booster, and never underestimate the silence. Because sometimes, the silence isn't empty, it's filled with eyes. I remember the whole thing like it was yesterday, even though it happened years ago. It wasn't a story I ever wanted to tell anyone, but it's always stuck with me, and I think about it whenever I hear about cabins or camping trips gone wrong. It was just supposed to be a simple weekend in the woods. Nothing more, nothing less. But it turned into one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. No ghosts, no monsters, just real life, and sometimes that's scarier. I was itching to get away from the city. The constant noise, the crowds, the never-ending stress of work and everyday life. I needed silence, peace, and fresh air. So I decided to rent a cabin for the weekend, somewhere remote. I found a listing online for a small cabin deep in the woods of the Appalachian Mountains. It wasn't fancy, but it was exactly what I wanted. No neighbors for miles, surrounded by nothing but trees, a small creek nearby, and the kind of quiet you don't get anywhere else. I packed my stuff carefully. Clothes for hiking, food supplies, a first aid kit, a flashlight, extra batteries, and a couple of books. I wasn't planning on being out there long, just 2 nights. The cabin had basic electricity and running water, which was a relief, and it was stocked with some essentials, like pots, pans, and blankets. I arrived late Friday afternoon, driving down a winding dirt road that got narrower the further I went. My phone lost signal about 10 miles before the cabin, but I was okay with that. I wanted to disconnect. The cabin was nestled in a small clearing surrounded by tall pine trees, their needles creating a soft carpet over the ground. It was quiet, except for the distant sound of the creek and the occasional bird call. The air smelled of pine sap and earth, clean and fresh. I unloaded my bags, set up the firewood I found stacked near the porch, and took a moment to just breathe. The sun was low, casting long shadows through the trees. That first night, I made a small fire in the stone fire pit outside. The crackling flames and the smell of burning wood were comforting. I cooked some canned chili on the little stove inside and sat by the window, watching the forest grow darker and darker. No sounds of traffic or neighbors, just nature. But as the night went on, I started to notice other noises, things that didn't quite fit with the usual forest sounds. There was a rustling in the underbrush, not like the wind blowing leaves, but something heavier, more deliberate. It wasn't close, but not far either, maybe 50 yards away. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal moving around, but the noise kept coming, shifting location slowly, circling the cabin maybe. I checked the locks on the doors and windows again, even though they felt sturdy enough. My flashlight's beam swept across the tree line, but I couldn't see anything. I tried to brush off the unease, telling myself I was just tired or imagining things. I went to bed with the curtains slightly open, hoping the natural light would help me feel safer in the morning. Morning came slow, filtered through the thin curtains and the tree branches. The cabin was cold inside. The fire had died down. I got up and went outside to stretch and get some fresh air. The forest looked peaceful in daylight, no sign of whatever had been making those noises. I gathered some fresh water from the creek nearby, which was clear and cold, and made coffee on the stove. I decided to take a short hike before lunch to explore the area and maybe find some better firewood for the evening. The trail started behind the cabin, winding through thick forest, sometimes following the creek. The air was cool and crisp, the ground soft underfoot. I noticed some broken branches on the path, like something big had passed through recently. It wasn't normal deer tracks. These were larger, heavier, and some looked like they might have been made by a human boot, but that didn't make sense. The area was supposed to be isolated. As I walked further, the forest grew denser, darker. The sunlight barely reached the forest floor, and I could hear the creek's water rushing louder, but no other sounds. Suddenly, the silence felt oppressive, like the forest was watching me. I stopped and looked around carefully. The trail behind me looked the same, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I decided to turn back and head to the cabin. On the way back, I noticed something strange near the edge of the creek. A small pile of rocks stacked carefully, like a marker. It looked recent. The stones were clean, no moss or dirt on them. I didn't think much of it at the time, just a hiker's cairn maybe. Back at the cabin, I spent the afternoon reading and fixing some things inside. I noticed the wood pile I had prepared for the fire was disturbed, like someone had been moving logs around, but there were no footprints or any clear signs of who it could have been. I checked the windows again, looked outside. No people, no cars, no lights. The sun was setting fast, and the sky turned shades of orange and purple. I built a fire again and settled down with my dinner. The woods grew dark, and the noises started again, louder this time. Something was moving in the bushes, snapping twigs, rustling leaves, just beyond the firelight. I kept the flashlight ready, shining it towards the sounds, but it was like the thing knew how to stay hidden. I didn't sleep well that night. Every little noise made me jump. At one point, I heard footsteps on the porch. I jumped out of bed, grabbed my flashlight, and rushed to the door. Nothing was there. No sign anyone had been outside except my own footprints in the dirt. But the door lock was scratched, like someone had tried to force it open. The next day, I was torn between packing up and leaving and staying just a little longer. I decided to stay. The last thing I wanted was to come all this way and miss out on the peace I'd hoped for. But I was more alert than ever. I spent most of the day inside, keeping the doors locked and windows shut. I even moved the furniture around so I could see every entrance from where I sat. The firewood pile was disturbed again. Logs moved closer to the cabin wall this time. Whoever or whatever was out there was getting bolder. Around midday, I found something else outside the cabin. Near the back door, pressed into the dirt, were deep footprints, large, heavy, like someone wearing thick boots. They led around the corner of the cabin and disappeared into the woods. There were no prints leading back, like whoever made them didn't come back the same way. My heart was pounding. I checked all the doors and windows again. Everything seemed locked tight, but that didn't explain the prints and the moved firewood. Someone had been here, close enough to touch the cabin, close enough to watch me. I thought about calling for help, but I had no signal on my phone. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and it was too far to walk. I realized how isolated I really was. I made sure the knife I brought with me was within reach and kept the flashlight ready. That night, I sat by the fire, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark woods like a knife. I could hear the noises again, the rustling, footsteps, snapping twigs, but I couldn't see anyone or anything. I decided to stay awake, watching every shadow, every movement. Hours passed. The fire burned low. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard it, a sharp, deliberate sound, like a rock being thrown. It hit the cabin wall just beside the window I was looking through. My heart jumped into my throat. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it out into the darkness. Nothing, no movement, no shape, but the feeling of danger was real now, heavy in the air. I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin anymore. I grabbed my backpack, loaded it with essentials, and waited for the first light of dawn. When the sky finally started to lighten, I moved quickly but quietly. I didn't want to make a noise that could give away my position. I followed the dirt road back toward my car, the only path out of the woods. The walk was tense. Every sound made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone to be following me. But I didn't see anyone. No cars, no people, just the empty woods. I finally reached the car around 7 a.m., exhausted and shaken. I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove off without looking back. Later, when I got home, I called the local ranger station to report what happened. They told me the area had recently been the target of poachers and some trespassers who'd been camping illegally. They said it wasn't unusual for people to sneak into remote cabins or campsites, sometimes to steal supplies or hide out. They warned me to be careful next time. Looking back, I realized I'd been lucky. I never saw the person who was out there. I never caught a glimpse of a face or a figure, only signs of their presence. The moved firewood, the footprints, the noises at night. Could have been anyone, and it could have turned violent at any time. That experience changed how I think about solitude and wilderness. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't ghosts or monsters, but the real danger of another person out there, hiding in the dark, watching you. I never went back to that cabin or the woods around it. The memory of those nights stays with me, a reminder that the wilderness is beautiful, but can also be a place where the unexpected and the dangerous wait just out of sight. And sometimes, that's I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. A quiet weekend alone in the woods, away from the noise of the city and the constant stream of people. The cabin I had rented was small, tucked deep in the forest, far from any town or road that saw much traffic. The idea was to disconnect, to sit in silence, to read, to sleep well. No distractions, just nature and myself. The drive out was long but peaceful. I passed through winding country roads lined with tall pine and spruce trees, their branches thick and heavy with needles, brushing the sky like they were trying to block out the sun. I parked my car at the small gravel lot near a trailhead marked on the rental instructions. From there, it was a 2-mile hike to the cabin. The path was narrow and overgrown in places, but well-worn enough that I never doubted I was going the right way. The air was fresh and cool, crisp in the early morning. I walked slowly, carrying a backpack with food, water, and a few supplies. Birds sang from the branches above, and occasionally, I caught glimpses of squirrels darting through the brush. The forest was peaceful, alive but calm. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked exactly like the pictures. A single-story structure, made from rough-hewn logs, with a small porch and a chimney that gave the hint of a wood stove inside. It was older but solid, with windows that looked out over a small clearing surrounded by thick trees. I set my pack down on the porch and took a deep breath. The silence here was different than in the city. It was heavy, almost pressing in on me. I liked it. Inside, the cabin was cozy. The wooden floor creaked slightly underfoot, and there was a faint smell of old wood mixed with a lingering scent of smoke. The furniture was simple: a table, a couple of chairs, a small bed in the corner, and a fireplace with a stack of firewood nearby. There was a small kitchen area with a sink and a propane stove. I spent the morning unpacking and settling in. I stacked some wood near the fireplace and started a fire to warm the cabin. The crackle of the flames was comforting. Outside, the wind rustled the branches, and light filtered through the leaves in shifting patterns. I had no cell phone signal here. I wasn't expecting to. That was part of why I came. No internet, no calls, no distractions. Just me and the forest. The first day passed quietly. I read a book, took short walks around the clearing, and prepared simple meals over the stove. The sun set earlier than I expected, and the darkness came quickly. The forest outside turned black except for the faint glow of stars overhead. I sat near the fire with a cup of tea and listened to the sounds outside. Owls hooted in the distance. Somewhere, a woodpecker tapped against a tree. The wind shifted, making the trees creak and groan. I felt safe, though this was nature, nothing dangerous. That night, I slept well, lulled by the fire's warmth and the steady rhythm of the forest. The next morning, I woke early to the pale light of dawn. I had planned to explore a little farther, to find the small lake mentioned in the rental description. After a quick breakfast, I packed a small day bag with water, a knife, a flashlight, and some snacks. The trail was faint but visible, winding deeper into the woods. As I walked, the trees grew thicker, the canopy overhead denser. The sunlight struggled to reach the forest floor. The air was cooler here, damper too. I noticed the ground was soft beneath my boots, covered with fallen needles and moss. The silence was still heavy, but now mixed with occasional animal sounds. a distant bird call, the rustle of something moving through the underbrush. About an hour into the hike, I heard it. A snapping of twigs, quick and sharp, coming from just off the path to my left. I stopped and listened, holding my breath. The sound didn't repeat, but the hairs on my neck stood up. I reminded myself that wildlife lived here. Deer, raccoons, maybe even bears or coyotes. I tightened my grip on the knife in my pack, just as a precaution, and moved on more carefully. After another half hour, I reached the lake. It was small and quiet, surrounded by thick brush and tall trees. The water was dark but clear enough to see the smooth stones beneath the surface. I sat on a fallen log and took a long drink from my water bottle. The stillness was soothing. I stayed there for a while, watching the water ripple as the wind blew over it. No one else was around. No signs of other hikers. I made my way back to the cabin by early afternoon. The hike felt longer going back, or maybe I was just more tired. The forest had changed subtly as the day progressed. The light softer, the shadows deeper. When I got back, I checked the cabin. The fire was mostly out, but there was still warmth in the ashes. I added more wood and got a fire going again. That night was the first time things started to feel off. I was in bed early, the fire dying down beside me. The cabin was quiet except for the occasional pop of burning wood. I was just about to drift off when I heard it. Another twig snapping, this time outside the window near the bed. I froze, staring into the dark glass. The moon was bright enough to show the outlines of trees and bushes, but I saw nothing moving. The noise came again, soft, deliberate, like footsteps crunching over dry leaves. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or some other animal, but the sound didn't move away, didn't wander off. It stayed close to the cabin, just outside the window. My heart started to race. I sat up and grabbed my flashlight. Shining it outside, I swept the beam over the bushes and trees. Nothing. No eyes reflecting back, no movement, just shadows. Still, I felt uneasy. I closed the curtains and lay back down, listening hard. The footsteps returned a few minutes later, this time on the wooden porch. The slow, soft thuds of boots or heavy shoes. They stopped outside the door. I sat perfectly still, breath held tight. The handle on the door rattled once. Then silence. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I decided to investigate. In the daylight, I inspected the porch carefully. There were no footprints in the dirt, too dry and crumbly to hold marks. But the wood of the porch had fresh scuffs, scratch marks as if someone had been trying to pry the door or the window. The lock on the door was old but sturdy, and it was intact. Still, the marks were new. Someone had been close. I checked the perimeter of the cabin for any other signs. Broken branches, disturbed leaves, anything that might indicate a path someone had taken. I found none. The rest of the day I spent trying to stay calm. I prepared a fire with extra wood and kept the door locked tight. I took short walks, but I stayed close to the cabin. That night, the noises came back. First, the footsteps on the porch again, slow and steady. Then the handle rattling. Then, a faint scraping sound, like a knife blade against wood. I lay on the bed, gripping the baseball bat I had found in the corner of the cabin. After what felt like hours, the sound stopped. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay inside all day. I took a walk deeper into the forest, trying to clear my head. As I walked, I noticed more signs of recent activity. Footprints in the dirt, broken branches, a small fire pit that wasn't there before. I realized someone else had been in these woods recently, maybe even living here for a while. That night, the noises were worse. The footsteps circled the cabin, sometimes pounding the porch with heavy stomps, sometimes light and quick. The scratching returned, this time at the windows, the door, even the walls. I stayed awake, bat in hand, listening to every sound. At one point, I heard voices, mumbled, low, but clear enough to tell they were close. I didn't dare open the window to listen. The following day, I packed my things. I was done. I wasn't going to wait to see who was out there or why they were watching me. As I prepared to leave, I heard something behind the cabin. A loud crash, like a tree branch breaking or something heavy falling. I froze, then moved cautiously toward the noise. In the small clearing behind the cabin, I found something I hadn't expected. There was a makeshift camp, hidden under a tarp strung between trees. Inside were empty cans, old clothes, and a small fire pit still warm. It was clear someone had been living there close by. I realized that the noises, the footsteps, the scratching, all of it came from someone nearby, someone who probably didn't want me there. I left the camp quickly, returning to the cabin to get my things. On my way out, I noticed something carved into the bark of a tree near the path. Just a single letter, scratched deep, H. I didn't know what it meant, but I didn't want to find out. The hike back to the car felt longer and more tense. Every sound in the forest seemed louder, every shadow darker. I kept the bat ready in my hand, eyes scanning the trees. When I finally reached my car and started the engine, I felt relief flood through me. I drove away fast, not looking back. That night, safe at home, I checked the news. A man had been arrested nearby, living illegally in the